Hey friends! Glad you're here at Gringotts Hub. We've cooked up something special. Harry claimed the Potter-Black-Slytherin-Merlin-Peverell Lordship and legally dismantled the entire Ministry of Magic. Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1, The Goblin's Ledger. The letter from Gringotts arrived on a Tuesday. Harry almost didn't open it. The summer had settled into a particular kind of grey misery, the sort that didn't shout or rage but simply sat on your chest in the morning and made getting out of bed feel like a negotiation. Sirius had been dead for 3 weeks. The house at Privet Drive smelled like cut grass and petrol fumes and the specific, suffocating normalcy that the Dursleys cultivated like a religion. Dudley had said exactly 4 words to him since he'd come home. Vernon had said fewer. Petunia brought meals to his door and didn't knock. He sat on the edge of his bed with the envelope in his hands for a long time. It was heavy cream parchment, sealed with wax the color of old gold, and embossed with the Gringotts crest, the dragon and the key. His name was written on the front in a script so precise it looked mechanical, every letter perfectly formed. Mr. H. J. Potter-Black. Bedroom 2, number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Potter-Black. He'd never been addressed that way before. He broke the seal. The letter was formal, dense with legal language, and largely incomprehensible on first reading. Harry read it twice, then a third time, parsing the goblin bureaucratic phrasing with the dogged patience of someone who had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. By the 4th read, the shape of it had become clear enough to make his stomach drop. The core of it was simple. Sirius Black had died intestate as far as the Ministry of Magic was concerned, because his will, filed with Gringotts 17 years ago and updated 3 times since, had never been formally registered with the Wizengamot. This was not an oversight. The Ministry had refused to register it on the grounds that Sirius was a convicted criminal. The fact that he had never been tried, never been convicted in any actual court of law, and had been cleared of all suspicion by the Ministry's own records the previous year had not, apparently, prompted anyone to revisit this decision. The Gringotts legal department was writing to inform him that as the sole named heir in Sirius Black's will, and as the heir presumptive to the House of Black under ancient bloodline protocols, Harry was being invited to attend a formal inheritance audit at Gringotts Bank, Diagon Alley, at his earliest convenience. The word invited was doing very heavy lifting. The tone of the letter, underneath the formal language, had the quality of someone saying you need to see this through very tightly pressed lips. Harry put the letter down on his desk and looked out the window at the Dursleys' back garden, where a sprinkler turned slow arcs through the afternoon heat. He picked up a quill and wrote back. "I'll be there Friday." He took the night bus. He didn't ask Dumbledore. He didn't write to the Order. He left at 7 in the morning before the Dursleys were awake, shouldered his backpack with his wand in his pocket and his Gringotts letter folded inside his shirt, and walked to the corner of Magnolia Crescent where the shadows were still long enough to be convincing. The triple-decker bus arrived in a sound like a thunderclap and a gust of exhaust, and Harry climbed aboard and paid 3 sickles for a one-way ticket to the Leaky Cauldron, and that was that. Stan Shunpike tried to make conversation. Harry answered in monosyllables, not unkindly, and watched London unspool through the scratched window while the bus lurched and hiccuped through the early traffic. The city looked the same as it always did. Vast and indifferent and going about its business. Harry found that oddly comforting. Diagon Alley was quiet at this hour. The shops were just opening, owners in aprons propping doors and spelling their windows clean, and the few people about were moving with the purposeful haste of people running early errands. Harry walked with his hood up and his head down, not out of fear. He was past fear of being recognized, somewhere in the grey weeks since Sirius's death, but out of habit. The scar on his forehead had been a navigational hazard for 5 years. Hiding it was muscle memory. Gringotts stood at the far end of the alley with the serene self-assurance of a building that had been here before the street existed and expected to remain long after. Harry climbed the marble steps, past the security troll with a nod that went unacknowledged, and pushed through the bronze doors into the cool, vaulted interior. A goblin at the nearest counter looked up. "Harry Potter," Harry said. "I have an appointment with Sharpax." Identification. Harry put his wand on the counter. The goblin picked it up, ran one knobbly finger along its length, and set it down again. A faint green light pulsed once along the marble and vanished. Third corridor, fourth door on the left. You are expected. Sharpax was old the way that certain stone walls are old, where the age isn't a weakness but a kind of consolidated density, all the years pressed down into something harder than what it started as. He was seated behind a desk that was covered in scrolls and ledgers in a completely organized fashion that only looked chaotic until you noticed that every document had been placed with geometric precision. He rose when Harry entered, a formal 4-inch bow, and gestured to the chair across from him. Mr. Potter-Black. Thank you for coming promptly. Thank you for writing. Harry sat down. Your letter suggested some urgency. It suggested, Sharpax said carefully, that there are matters requiring your attention. The urgency is something we can discuss once you understand the full scope of those matters. He opened a ledger on his desk, bound in dark leather, its spine marked with the Potter crest and, beside it, the Black family seal, and folded his hands on top of it. Before we begin, I should inform you that this meeting will be conducted under the Goblin Oath of Professional Confidence. Nothing discussed within this room will be shared with any external party, human or otherwise, without your explicit authorization. Is that acceptable? Yes. Good. Sharpax turned the ledger to face Harry. Then let us begin with the inheritance audit. Mr. Potter, are you aware of how many vaults you currently hold at Gringotts? Harry blinked. 1. The Potter family vault. Vault 687. Sharpax's expression didn't change, but something in his dark eyes did, a fractional shift, there and gone, that in a goblin of his age and experience was roughly equivalent to someone else wincing visibly. You have 11 vaults, Sharpax said. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere down the corridor, Harry could hear the distant rumble of a mine cart. I'm sorry, Harry said. 11. 11. The Potter Family Trust Vault, that would be your Vault 687, which you have been accessing since age 11. The Potter Ancestral Vault, Vault 12, which was sealed upon your parents' deaths pending the reading of their will. Sharpax paused. Which has not yet occurred. Their will hasn't been read. Their will has not been formally executed, no. Sharpax kept his voice level. It was filed with this institution in October of 1981, a week before your parents' deaths, during what appeared to be a period of preparation for eventuality. It names you as sole heir. It also contains instructions regarding guardianship which differ from the arrangement that was subsequently made by Albus Dumbledore without reference to that document. Harry said nothing. He had known, somewhere, in the cold analytical part of his mind that had been getting louder and clearer since Sirius's death, that something like this was coming. The letter had told him. The formal language, the careful phrasing, the at your earliest convenience that meant now, he had known there was something here he hadn't been told. He just hadn't known how large it would be. Tell me all of it, he said. That, Sharpax said, is precisely what I intend to do. It took 2 hours. Sharpax laid it out with the methodical precision of someone who had been waiting a long time to say these things to someone who could actually act on them, and who was not going to rush the telling now that the moment had arrived. He started with the Potter Ancestral Vault, its contents, its value, the specific clauses of James Potter's will that had never been executed. He moved from there to the Black Estate, which was considerably larger and more complicated, and which included not just Grimmauld Place but 3 other properties, a controlling interest in 7 wizarding businesses, a seat on the board of St. Mungo's Hospital, and enough gold in the Ancestral Vault to make Harry's eyes go slightly unfocused when he read the figure. Then Sharpax turned to the third ledger. The House of Slytherin, he said, has had no recognized heir since the mid-17th century. The bloodline, as traced by Goblin genealogical records, which are rather more thorough than the Ministry's, and considerably more accurate, terminates in 4 living descendants. 3 are unaware of the connection. The 4th is Tom Marvolo Riddle, known as Lord Voldemort. He paused. However, there is a legal principle of heritage forfeiture under ancient wizarding law, dating to the Goblin Accords of 1192, which states that a lord who dies in a state of magical instability, specifically, the fragmentation of the soul, forfeits hereditary claim. As Riddle's soul is, fragmented, to put it delicately, his claim to the Slytherin lordship is legally void. Harry was very still. And who does it pass to? By bloodline precedent and the law of magical inheritance, it passes to the individual who carries the greatest convergence of ancient house bloodlines. Sharpax held Harry's gaze. Your mother, Lily Evans Potter, was a Muggle-born. This is the understanding held by the Ministry of Magic, Hogwarts, and the broader wizarding world. It is not entirely accurate. Mrs. Potter was Muggle-raised. She was not, strictly speaking, Muggle-born. Harry felt the words land somewhere in his chest. What do you mean? Her magical line traces, on her mother's side, through a suppressed branch of the Peverell family. Ignotus Peverell's line did not end with his known descendants. There was a secondary line, illegitimate by the standards of the time, unregistered, the records obscured over 3 centuries, which passed through a series of Muggle-adjacent families before surfacing, strongly, in Lily Evans. Sharpax opened a 4th ledger and turned it to face Harry. Your mother was a Peverell descendant. You are a Peverell heir. Harry looked at the genealogical chart spread across both pages. The lines were fine as spider silk, converging and diverging over centuries, names in Latin and Old English and something older still, and at the bottom of it all, his own name, sitting at the junction of more lines than he could immediately count. The 5th, he said. Merlin. Sharpax inclined his head. The House of Merlin has no physical estate and no gold. It is a title only, the oldest magical title in British wizarding history, carried by no family since Merlin himself. It cannot be inherited by blood because the bloodline died with Merlin's only child in the 6th century. It can, however, be claimed, by any witch or wizard who demonstrates a sufficient convergence of ancient magical lineages and who undergoes the right of claim at a place of sufficient magical depth. He paused. You carry Potter, Black, Slytherin through void transfer, and Peverell. 4 ancient lines in one living person. The last time that occurred was in 1521, and the individual in question died before they could claim anything because the ministry of the time had them quietly poisoned. The room was very quiet. I'm not going to be quietly poisoned, Harry said. No, Sharpax agreed. I don't believe you are. Which is, in part, why this institution chose to write to you rather than to simply wait for someone else to notice what the ledgers contained. He folded his hands. Mr. Potter-Black. Are you aware of the inheritance suppression clauses that were invoked on your accounts following your parents' deaths? Harry shook his head. Sharpax opened a 5th ledger. Between November 1981 and September 1991, a total of 14 withdrawal authorizations were made on the Potter Trust Vault by persons who were not you and had no legal authority to access that vault. These withdrawals total a sum of, he indicated a figure on the page, this amount. The withdrawals were authorized under a guardianship clause, which would be legal if your guardian were your designated guardian under the terms of your parents' will. They were not. Your parents designated one Sirius Orion Black as your magical guardian, and one Frank and Alice Longbottom as secondary guardians. No one consulted either the will or the designated guardians. Harry looked at the figure on the page. He looked at it for a long time. Petunia and Vernon Dursley, he said, have been drawing money from my vault. No. Petunia and Vernon Dursley are Muggles. They cannot access Gringotts. The withdrawals were made by authorized magical users presenting letters of guardianship that were not legally valid. Sharpax's tone remained neutral, but there was something underneath it, something with edges. We can discuss the specifics of who made those withdrawals at a later point. I would first like to ensure you understand the full picture. Harry nodded, once. He was keeping his face very still. He had learned that from Sirius, not from Sirius alive, but from the memory of Sirius in the Pensieve, standing in front of the Wizengamot with Dumbledore's hand on his shoulder and his face carefully blank while Dumbledore did the talking. He was done with other people doing the talking. "There's more," he said. It wasn't a question. "Your magical signature," Sharpak said, "has been carrying 4 suppression charms since you were 15 months old. They are layered under your standard tracking and monitoring enchantments, the kind placed on all underage wizards by the Ministry, but they predate those and are of a different origin. They have been preventing your core from developing at its natural rate. Think of it as," he considered the analogy for a moment, "a plant grown in a container too small for its roots. It grows. But not as it would have." Harry looked down at his hands. "How much of a difference would there be," he said carefully, "if they were removed?" "We don't know exactly. We can tell you that your magical core, even suppressed, reads as significantly above the normal range for a wizard of your age. Unsuppressed, we would anticipate," Sharpax paused. "We would anticipate that you would be one of the most powerful magical individuals alive." "Right," Harry said. He leaned back in the chair and looked up at the ceiling, which was plastered in geometric patterns of gold and green, and breathed in and out for a moment. He thought about 5 years of being told he was mediocre. He thought about Snape's face, patient and contemptuous, telling him he had no subtlety, no discipline, no natural talent for occlumency or potions or anything that required actual skill. He thought about Umbridge's pink cardigan and her voice like a knife wrapped in felt telling him that no amount of effort would make him exceptional. He thought about Dumbledore's careful, measured praise, always emphasizing qualities of character, of bravery, of love, and the way it had never once made him feel as though he was being told the truth. He thought about Sirius. He brought his gaze back down to Sharpak's desk. "Can you remove the suppression charms?" "Yes. The process requires approximately an hour and is not entirely comfortable." "I don't care about comfortable." He paused. "Can you also perform the inheritance rite today?" "All 5 claims, including Merlin." Sharpak's expression did something complex. "The Merlin claim would need to be performed in a chamber of sufficient magical depth. We have such a chamber 4 levels below the main floor. As for the other 4, yes. All inheritance claims can be performed consecutively." He looked at Harry steadily. This would be an unprecedented action. The last time a single individual held 3 or more ancient lordships simultaneously was 400 years ago. Holding 5 would be, historically significant. "I understand that. You would be, legally, a majority voice in the Wizengamot. The Potter, Black, Slytherin, and Peverell seats collectively represent more weighted votes than any current alliance of houses. The Merlin seat, additionally, carries a historical veto right over any ministry legislation that predates 1215, a right that has never been exercised because no one has ever been in a position to exercise it." "I understand that too." Sharpak studied him for a moment. He seemed to be performing some calculation that had nothing to do with numbers. Then he closed the ledger on his desk and stood up. "Then let us proceed," he said. "I would suggest we begin with the suppression charm removal. What follows will be more manageable with your core operating at full capacity." The suppression charm removal happened in a room 2 floors below Sharpak's office, a small, spare chamber with walls of bare granite and a single chair in the center that had been carved from what looked like a single piece of black stone. 4 goblin practitioners arranged themselves at cardinal points around the chair, each holding instruments that Harry couldn't name, long-handled things of silver and dark wood that hummed with a frequency just below hearing. "This will be uncomfortable," Sharpax had said in the corridor. That was, Harry reflected as the first of the 4 charms began to dissolve, a fairly significant understatement. It wasn't pain exactly, or rather, it was pain but not the sharp, external kind, not the scar-burning scream of Voldemort's anger. It was more like the sensation of something that had been pressed flat for a very long time being allowed to expand, like a fist unclenching after years of being held closed, and the muscles involved had forgotten how to do it and had to be reminded forcibly. His magic moved through him in waves, each one larger than the last, and by the time the third charm came loose Harry had gripped the arms of the black chair hard enough that his knuckles had gone white and his vision was doing something interesting at the edges. The fourth charm broke with a sound that Harry felt rather than heard, a deep, resonant crack that ran through the floor and walls and apparently, he would learn later, was felt as a mild tremor on the floor above. The goblin practitioners stepped back. One of them said something in gobbledygook that the others acknowledged with short, sharp nods. Harry sat in the chair and breathed. The world felt different. Not larger exactly, the room was the same room, the walls were the same walls, but there was a quality to everything, a texture, that hadn't been there before. He could feel the ambient magic of the building around him the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, not precisely, not with detail, but as a general pervasive awareness, a sense of the enormous weight of enchantment in the stone and gold and air of this place. He reached out with his right hand and summoned his wand from his jacket pocket without saying a word. It flew to his hand. Fast, faster than he'd expected, and when his fingers closed around it the familiar warmth was there but amplified, the connection between wizard and wand a clearer signal than it had ever been, like hearing a voice you knew well through a clean line after years of static. He cast a lumos. The light that came from the wand tip was bright enough to make him squint. Satisfactory, one of the goblin practitioners said, in a tone that suggested it was rather more than that. The inheritance right for the first 4 houses took place in a circular chamber 2 floors further down, its walls carved with the crests of every ancient British magical house in a continuous frieze that circled the room at shoulder height. The floor was inlaid with a compass rows of different magical metals, iron and silver and something that looked like solidified amber, and in the center was a stone plinth about waist height with a flat surface that held a single shallow bowl of clear liquid. Sharpax explained the process with efficient brevity, a drop of blood in the bowl, a spoken declaration, and the magic of the bank would do the rest. The bowl recognized bloodline connections that even the claimant might not be aware of, and the rite itself was self-verifying, it couldn't be forged or falsified, and it couldn't be denied if the connection was real. One at a time, or all at once? Harry asked. Ideally one at a time for ease of processing, Sharpax said. However, given the unusual nature of the convergence, and given that we are uncertain how the magic will respond to a simultaneous claim of this scale, we recommend all at once. Harry picked up the small ritual knife from the plinth and looked at it. What would you recommend for all at once? 3 drops. And then speak the declaration, I am heir of all, I claim what is mine, and I hold what I claim. Is that it? It's the words that carry the meaning, Sharpax said. The magic supplies the rest. Harry turned the knife in his fingers and held it over the bowl. One cut, quick and clean, across the pad of his index finger. 3 drops fell into the clear liquid. They hit the surface and spread like ink, dark red at the center, then warming outward in rings of gold and silver and a deep, resonant green, and then a last color that had no exact name, something between violet and black that pulsed once and settled. Harry looked up. He felt something gathering in the room, some shift in the quality of attention, not threatening, not hostile, but aware. As though the building itself had turned to look at him. I am heir of all, he said. I claim what is mine. And I hold what I claim. The liquid in the bowl flashed white, brilliant, sudden, filling the room, and then every crest in the frieze around the walls lit in sequence, one after another, 4 of them blazing gold before going dark again. On the plinth, the bowl was empty. Whatever had been in it was gone. The lights in the room shifted. They were no longer the cold blue-white of goblin lighting. They were warmer. Gold. Sharpax looked at the plinth for a moment, then looked at Harry with an expression that was, for a goblin, remarkably close to what a human might call awestruck. The rite recognizes you, he said, as Lord of the Houses Potter, Black, Slytherin, and Peverell. Goblin law and record will reflect this from this moment. You are entitled to a formal sealed document, which we will prepare. The Wisingamot House registers will be notified by formal courier within the hour, under banking law, which requires notification within 24 hours of any claim on a registered noble house. He paused. The ministry will know by morning. Good, Harry said. The Merlin rite must be performed 4 levels below us, Sharpax added. Are you ready to proceed? Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought of Sirius, not the way he'd been thinking of him for 3 weeks, in the grey grief of it, but differently. He thought of Sirius in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place, alive and restless and burning with everything he'd never been allowed to do, leaning across the table and saying you're more like your father than you know, Prongs Jr., and then catching himself, because Harry wasn't his father, Harry was something else, something Sirius hadn't quite had the vocabulary for yet. I know what I am now, Harry thought. And I know what was taken from me. And I know who did the taking. Yes, he said. Let's go. The chamber 4 levels below the main floor of Gringotts was the oldest part of the building, and it showed. The walls were not carved or finished, they were raw stone, deep granite worn smooth only by the passage of centuries of air, and the magical depth of the place was not subtle. It pressed against Harry's newly cleared senses like deep water, vast and patient and almost geological in its weight. There were no lights in the chamber. The illumination came from the stone itself, a faint, bioluminescent blue-green that had no discernible source. The Merlin claim is different, Sharpax said, and his voice was quieter down here, careful, the way you'd speak in a place that was listening. It cannot be inherited. It must be recognized. The magic of this place will determine whether you are worthy of the title. The process is not under our control. We will remain here, but we can offer no guidance during the rite itself. How will I know what to do? Sharpax looked at him steadily. You will know, he said, with the certainty of someone quoting something older than themselves. Harry walked to the center of the chamber. The stone under his feet resonated differently here, each step carried a slight vibration up through his legs, almost subaudible, like the world clearing its throat. He stopped. He stood still. He waited. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then the magic in the chamber moved. It didn't move the way a spell moved, directional, purposeful, human-authored. It moved the way tides move, or seasons, something with its own rhythm and intention that preceded every wizard who had ever lived and would outlast everyone who ever would. It rose through the floor and the walls and the air and moved through Harry the way deep cold moves through water, from the outside in, and every part of him it touched, it read. There was no other word for it. He felt it reading him, the grief and the anger, the 5 years of being caged and underfed magically and emotionally, the love for Ron and Hermione and the hollow space where Sirius had been, the cold determined clarity that had replaced the hot teenage panic somewhere in the 3 weeks since the Department of Mysteries. It read all of it, the entire archive of Harry James Potter, and it didn't flinch from any of it. Then it receded. And in its place, settling into him like the last layer of something that had always been incomplete, came a recognition so simple and so final that Harry nearly laughed. The stone floor lit under his feet, 4 points of gold and 1 of silver, 5-pointed, an old star, older than any magic he had a name for. The chamber's bioluminescence intensified. Somewhere above, he would learn later, every ward in the bank pulsed once simultaneously, and 3 of the goblins on the main floor stopped mid-transaction, looked up, and said nothing. He walked back to Sharpax. His footsteps on the old stone were very steady. Well? Sharpax said. It said yes, Harry said. He emerged from Gringotts at 2:30 in the afternoon into a Diagon alley that looked, superficially, exactly the same as it had when he went in. But the light seemed more legible. The sounds were sharper. He stood on the marble steps for a moment with his backpack over one shoulder and his wand in his hand. He hadn't put it away yet, he wasn't ready to, and he looked down the alley at the summer crowds moving through their ordinary afternoon. He thought about everything Sharpax had shown him. The ledgers. The withdrawals. The suppression charms. The will that had never been read, the guardians who had never been consulted, the name, Potter-Black, that had been sitting in a filing system somewhere in this bank for 15 years while he slept in a cupboard under the stairs and learned, slowly and consistently, that he was allowed to exist but not to matter. He thought about all the people who had looked at him and seen a weapon, or a symbol, or a story, or a problem. He thought about how very few of them had ever looked at him and seen a person. Then he put his wand away, descended the steps, and walked down Diagon Alley toward the leaky cauldron, because there was something he needed to do before he went home. He needed to think. And for the first time in his life, he had enough space inside himself to do it properly. He found a table at the back of the leaky cauldron, ordered a butterbeer he didn't particularly want, and sat down with a blank piece of parchment in front of him and a quill in his hand. At the top of the parchment, he wrote, "What I know." He wrote for 2 hours. He wrote everything, the timeline from Sharpak's ledgers, the suppression charms, the illegal guardianship withdrawals, the will, the Wisengamot voting structure that Sharpax had explained to him in the last 15 minutes of their meeting, the 5 seats and what they meant, the historical veto right attached to the Merlin title. He wrote what Dumbledore had done and what Fudge had done and what the system had allowed and encouraged both of them to do. He wrote without rage. The rage was there, he could feel it, banked and steady, but he wrote around and through it, because the rage wasn't useful. The information was useful. When he was done, he looked at the page. He thought, this is what accountability looks like before it starts. He folded the parchment and put it in his jacket and finished the butterbeer that had gone warm. Outside the dirty windows of the leaky cauldron, Muggle London moved through its afternoon, oblivious and enormous. He watched it for a moment. Tomorrow, he would write to Hermione. Not to tell her everything, not yet. He would ask her one question first, because with Hermione you had to let her think it was a research problem before you let it become a moral crisis, or she'd get the two confused and be useless for both. The question was, what does it take to table a motion in the Wisengamot without ministerial sponsorship? He would bet every galleon in Vault 12 that she would have the answer within 48 hours, full citation, annotated bibliography, and 3 counterarguments she'd have already addressed on his behalf. He allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, something that was almost a smile. Harry Potter put on his hood, shouldered his backpack, and walked out into the afternoon. He had a ministry to dismantle. He thought he should probably start with the paperwork. He was back at Privet Drive by 5. He went up to his room, sat at his desk, and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Hermione. The second was to Neville Longbottom, and it said simply, I need to talk to you. Not by owl, face to face. Can you get to London this week? He sealed both, sent them with Hedwig, watched her white shape diminish into the evening sky, and then turned back to his desk and began a 3rd letter. This one was addressed to Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, Headmaster, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and it said, Dear Professor Dumbledore, I wanted to let you know that I visited Gringotts today. I was there for most of the day. It was very informative. Regards, Harry Potter-Black. He used the hyphenate deliberately. He addressed the envelope, sealed it, and left it on his desk for the morning. He lay down on his bed, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. The suppression charms were gone and his magic sat in him differently now, fuller, more present, like a room that had been opened after being shut for years. It would take time to learn what it meant, what it could do. He was patient about that. He had other things to be impatient about. He thought about Sirius, properly, quietly, the way he hadn't let himself think yet, and the grief came, clean and unambiguous, and he let it. He didn't push it away. It had earned its place. After a while, the grief settled into something quieter. Not gone. Just occupying its proper space alongside everything else. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow, the letters would arrive where they were going. And then things would start to move. The letter to Dumbledore arrived at Hogwarts at 11 that night. A house elf brought it to the headmaster's office on a silver tray. Dumbledore was still at his desk, as he often was at this hour, a cup of tea at his elbow and a series of order reports spread in front of him in the careful disorder of someone managing more information than any single mind should comfortably hold. He read the letter twice. Then he set it down and looked at Fawkes, who was watching him from his perch with the clear, liquid attention of a creature that knew things about time that its owner didn't always acknowledge. "Well," Dumbledore said, very quietly. He picked up his teacup. His hand, holding it, was perfectly steady. But he didn't drink from it for a very long time. Chapter 2, Declarations. Hermione's reply arrived in 31 hours. Harry had expected fast. He hadn't expected that fast, and the thickness of the envelope. Hedwig landed on his windowsill with the self-satisfied dignity of a postal worker who knows they're delivering something important, told him everything before he'd even broken the seal. He counted the pages. 7. Dense on both sides, Hermione's handwriting in 3 different ink colors because she used red for citations and green for her own counterarguments and blue for the main body, a system she developed in 3rd year and apparently never abandoned. He read it standing at his window in the early morning light while Hedwig ate from her bowl and made quiet, proprietary sounds. The answer to his question, what does it take to table a motion in the Wisengamot without ministerial sponsorship, was on page 1, concise and unambiguous. Any recognized lord or lady of an ancient house could table a motion directly if they held a registered seat. The ministry could not block the tabling, only the vote. Pages 2 through 4 were the legal framework, cited chapter and verse from Wizarding Governance, a comparative history, the statutes of Merlin 1347, and something called Hestwick's Annotated Wisengamot Procedures, 4th edition. Pages 5 and 6 were Hermione working out, visibly and in real time, why Harry was asking this particular question, the green ink getting more emphatic as she went. Page 7 was a single paragraph in blue, Harry. I don't know exactly what you found at Gringotts, but I know you well enough to know you're not asking abstract questions. Whatever you're planning, please don't do it without telling me first. Not because I'll try to stop you. Because I want to help. H. Below that, in red, also the answer is yes, you can table without sponsorship, but you need to file notice 14 days in advance unless the Wisengamot is an emergency session, in which case a lord with 3 or more seats can call an emergency session themselves. I thought you should know that. Harry read that last line twice. 3 or more seats. He had 5. He sat down on his bed, Hermione's letter in his hand, and thought about the 14 days. 14 days felt like a long time. It also felt like just long enough. He picked up his quill. Neville's reply arrived 2 days later, brief and characteristically direct. Grands in London Thursday for the Apothecary Guild annual meeting. I could be at the Leaky Cauldron by noon. Is this about what I think it's about? And, Harry wrote back, I don't know what you think it's about. But probably yes. He spent the intervening days reading. Not novels, not schoolbooks. Sharpax had sent him, via Gringotts' private courier, a collection of documents that occupied most of the space on his desk and required him to relocate Hedwig's cage to the windowsill, the full texts of the Potter and Black wills, a comprehensive Wisengamot procedure manual, the Goblin genealogical report on his bloodline, a bound set of inheritance law texts, and, in a sealed envelope marked for your information, not for circulation, a list of every withdrawal made from the Potter Trust Vault between 1981 and 1991. The withdrawals list was 2 pages long. Harry read it once, set it face down on the desk, and didn't read it again. He knew what it said. He knew what it meant. That was enough for now. He read everything else with care. He took notes. He built a picture, piece by piece, of the legal architecture of the wizarding world, not as it had been explained to him in 5 years of Hogwarts education, casually and incidentally, but as it actually functioned, the formal structure of it, the places where the structure had been exploited or corrupted or simply hollowed out by decades of bad practice and complicit inaction. The picture that emerged was not flattering. The Wisengamot had 73 seats. Of those, 41 were occupied by hereditary noble houses. 14 were ministry-appointed. 18 were elected. The ministry-appointed seats had, in practice, voted as a bloc with the minister's preferences for the past 30 years, which meant Fudge currently commanded a coalition of 32 votes on any given issue, just under half, but enough to control most procedural decisions and enough to block most substantive ones. The ancient house block theoretically held the balance of power, but the ancient houses had been so thoroughly fragmented by a century of Voldemort-adjacent politics, blood purity debates, and simple exhaustion that in practice, 12 of the 41 hereditary seats had no current holder, and another 8 were held by families who voted with fudge as a matter of custom. Harry's 5 seats changed that arithmetic considerably. He sat with that thought for a long time on the second evening, at his desk with the summer dark outside and Hedwig asleep and the house quiet around him. He did the numbers in his head, slowly and carefully, the way he might work a chess problem. The weighted voting system that Sharpax had explained, ancient houses each carried 2 votes, ministry appointed carried 1, elected carried 1, meant that Harry's 5 seats were worth 10 votes in a weighted division. 10 votes, applied at the right moment, to the right questions, in the right order. He started a new piece of parchment. At the top, he wrote, what needs to happen, and in what order. Thursday arrived grey and close, the sky pressing low over Little Whinging in the particular way it did before summer rain. Harry told Vernon he was going out, a statement, not a request, which produced a brief red-faced silence and then a grunt that served as permission, and took the night bus to the Leaky Cauldron, arriving just before noon with his notes in his inside pocket and a calmness in him that he recognized as something new, something he hadn't had before the Gringotts visit. Not detachment. More like sureness of footing. The feeling of knowing where you stand. Neville was already there, at the same table in the back where Harry had sat 4 days ago. He looked different from how he'd looked at the end of term, not physically, particularly, but in his bearing, something that happened to Neville every summer when he was away from school and the habit of being underestimated could settle a bit. He sat at the table with his hands around a cup of tea and his shoulders straight, and when he saw Harry he nodded with the quiet friendliness of someone who had been thinking about this meeting since the owl arrived. You look different, Neville said, as Harry sat down. Do I? Less like you're carrying something. Neville considered. Or, no. More like you've decided what to do with what you're carrying. Harry looked at him. There had always been more to Neville than most people bothered to notice, including Harry himself, and that was a failing he intended to correct. You always been this perceptive? Gran says I have my mum's eyes, Neville said simply. She means the color, but I think she also means the other thing. I just don't, I didn't used to say things out loud very much. Past tense. Neville picked up his tea. 5th year changed some things. Harry nodded. The Department of Mysteries had changed things for all of them, but Neville had gone in as the person nobody quite believed in and come out as someone who had held his ground against Death Eaters with a broken nose and kept fighting anyway. He'd earned something there that had nothing to do with what anyone thought of him. I need to tell you some things, Harry said. Some of it will be surprising. Some of it might be upsetting, because it involves the way things work, and I know you've been thinking about that too. House Longbottom and all that. Something shifted in Neville's expression, careful, but not closed. My gran has been trying to get me to take the Longbottom seat on the Wisingamot since I turned 15, he said. I keep saying I'm not ready. She keeps saying I'm more ready than I think. She's right, Harry said. And I might need you to be ready fairly soon. He laid it out for Neville the way he'd laid it out for himself on the 2 pages of notes, no preamble, no softening, just the facts in order. The Gringotts meeting. The 5 lordships. The suppression charms. The will. The illegal withdrawals. The Wisingamot arithmetic. Neville listened with his elbows on the table and his eyes moving through the middle distance with the look of someone assembling something as they received the pieces, and he didn't interrupt once. When Harry finished, Neville was quiet for a moment. The Potter will name Sirius as your guardian, he said. Yes. Sirius was never tried. No. So he was in Azkaban for 12 years for a crime the Ministry never actually proved he committed, which means the guardianship they gave your aunt and uncle was illegal from the start. Neville let out a breath. Not a sigh exactly, more the sound of someone recalculating. My parents' case, he said. The Lestranges. They were tried. But the trial records, I've tried to look at them. Gran asked the ministry office twice for the full transcripts, and they keep saying the records are restricted. Why would they be restricted? That, Neville said, is a question I have been asking for 4 years. He paused. If you're going into the Wizengamot, and you're tabling motions, I want to table one too. About the restricted trial records for all the Death Eater cases from the First War. All of them. Harry looked at him. You should claim your seat first. I know. I'll write to Gran tonight. A pause. She's going to be insufferable about being right. You can handle insufferable, Harry said. That got a small, real smile from Neville, not the nervous kind, not the apologetic kind, but the kind that was just Neville when there was something solid under his feet. Hermione arrived in London the following Saturday. She came by Fleur to the Leaky Cauldron with a bag that suggested she'd packed for a week and a look that suggested she was ready to have a very serious conversation whether Harry was prepared for one or not. He met her at the fireplace while she was still brushing soot from her jacket sleeve, and she took one look at his face and said, "Tell me everything," and they found a private booth and he did. He watched her face while he talked. Hermione's face while she was processing difficult information was one of the more expressive natural phenomena Harry had encountered. Her expressions moved through stages the way weather moved through a sky, quick and layered, and you could read the whole argument she was having with herself if you knew what to look for. There was the initial intake, eyebrows up, that slight parting of the lips that meant bigger than I expected. Then the analytical phase, where her eyes went still and her jaw set and she was running calculations. Then the moment where the calculations produced a result she didn't like, and she had to decide whether to argue with the math or accept it, a small tightening around her eyes, there and gone. And then, last, the ethical reckoning, which in Hermione always looked like someone walking to the edge of something they'd been told not to cross and looking down. When he got to the part about the illegal withdrawals, she put both hands flat on the table. The guardianship was void, she said. Not a question. From day one. Which means everything done under it, void. Harry. She looked at him. That means 5 years of Hogwarts governance decisions made with Dumbledore as your de facto magical guardian were made without legal authority. He'd thought of that. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. I've spent 5 years, she said slowly, citing rules and following procedures, and I wrote essays about Wizengamot procedure in my 3rd year, Harry, because I thought it was important to understand how the governance structure worked. I thought it was basically sound, even if it had problems. I thought the problems were correctable from inside. Maybe they are, Harry said. Correctable from inside. That's actually what I'm planning. She looked at him sharply. Not burning it down. I can't burn it down, Hermione. Even if I wanted to. Which I don't, particularly. The point isn't destruction. He picked up his quill and tapped it against the table twice. The point is that there's a legal structure. It's been manipulated and corrupted, but the structure itself, the Wizengamot, the charter, the ancient laws, those were actually built to do something real. I want to make them do what they were supposed to do. He paused. With a significant amount of application of force. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat back, opened her bag, pulled out Hestwick's annotated Wizengamot procedures, and said, "All right. Show me what you've got so far." Dumbledore came on Sunday. Harry was in his room reading when he heard the knock at the front door, not through any magical perception, just the ordinary sound of it, followed by Vernon's voice going from confused to alarmed in the way it did when he encountered anything connected to Harry's world. There was a brief muffled exchange and then footsteps on the stairs, 2 sets, and Vernon knocked on Harry's door with the specific reluctance of a man who would much rather be watching television. "There's someone here to see you," Vernon said, opening the door approximately 4 inches. "Old man. Long, there's a bird." "I know who it is," Harry said. He put down his book and stood up. Tell him I'll be down in a minute. He stood in the middle of his room for a moment after Vernon's footsteps retreated, and breathed in and out. He thought, I am not angry. I am clear. He went downstairs. Dumbledore was in the sitting room. Fawkes perched on the back of Vernon's armchair, which Vernon was standing several feet away from, pressed against the far wall with the expression of a man encountering something theologically unacceptable. Petunia had apparently made tea on instinct and was holding the tray in the kitchen doorway, unsure whether to enter. Dumbledore looked exactly as he always did, the half-moon spectacles, the silver beard, the robes of deep blue that seemed to belong to a slightly different era from everything around him. He stood when Harry entered and his expression was warm and careful and layered with something underneath it that Harry, with his newly clarified perceptions, could read more clearly now: concern, yes, but also the specific concern of a chess player who has just realized that a piece they considered stable has moved unexpectedly. Harry, Dumbledore said. I hoped we might talk. We can talk, Harry said. He sat down on the sofa, unhurriedly, and looked at Dumbledore with the same quiet attention he'd been practicing for the past week. Tea. He glanced at Petunia. She came forward, set the tray down, and left the room with the dignified haste of someone removing themselves from a situation. Dumbledore sat in the armchair that Fawkes wasn't occupying and poured 2 cups with the ease of someone comfortable performing small domestic acts. He handed Harry's across. Harry took it. Your letter was interesting, Dumbledore said. I thought it might be. The use of the hyphenate. Dumbledore's eyes were steady above the rim of his own cup. Potter-Black. That was deliberate. Everything in the letter was deliberate, Harry said. Including the length. A pause. Something moved in Dumbledore's expression, acknowledgement, Harry thought. The recognition of a particular kind of directness. How much did Gringotts tell you? Everything that was in the ledgers, Harry said. Which was considerable. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. I know about the will, Professor. I know what it said about my guardianship. I know about the suppression charms. I know about the withdrawals from my vault. He let a beat of silence do its work. I also know about my inheritance. Dumbledore was quiet. He set his teacup down precisely on its saucer. Outside, a car went past in the street, and a lawnmower started somewhere down the road, and the afternoon went on about its ordinary business without any awareness that something significant was happening in this sitting room. I should have told you more, Dumbledore said. Sooner. And I should have told you in a way that was your choice to hear, rather than mine to manage. He met Harry's eyes. I am sorry for that, Harry. Genuinely. I believe you, Harry said, because he did. And I want you to know that I understand the reasoning. You thought that if I knew too much too soon, about Voldemort, about the prophecy, about what I was and what I was inheriting, it would be too much weight. You thought you were protecting me. I did, Dumbledore said quietly. I know. Harry picked up his tea. But you also took choices away from me that weren't yours to take. And some of what was done under your authority, or without your authority but without your intervention, was genuinely harmful. Not just to me. To Sirius. To the people my parents named as guardians. The name landed in the room. Dumbledore closed his eyes for a moment. Sirius, he said. He should have been my guardian, Harry said. He should have been found and tried and exonerated and given custody of me. None of that happened, and he lost 12 years in Azkaban, and then he lost 2 more years in Grimmauld Place, and then he died. And I know that's not your fault in the way that it would be if you'd thrown him through the veil yourself. But. Harry paused. Some of it is. Dumbledore didn't answer. He didn't offer a defense or an explanation. He simply sat with what Harry had said, and his face was the face of a man who had long since stopped arguing with that particular truth. What are you going to do? Dumbledore said, finally. I'm going to the Wizengamot, Harry said. I filed notice of intent to table 5 motions. I have the procedural right to do that, as you know. I've written to the Wisengamot clerk and the filing went through yesterday morning. He watched Dumbledore's face. I thought you should know. Out of courtesy. Not to ask permission. No. Dumbledore looked at him. Really looked, the way he sometimes did, with the full weight of whatever it was that made him extraordinary, not just intelligence but a kind of depth of attention, the quality of someone who had been looking at people for a very long time and still found them genuinely interesting. You've grown up, Dumbledore said. Not a compliment, not a criticism. Just an observation, said with the particular cadence of someone who had hoped for it and feared it simultaneously. Yes, Harry said. Fairly recently. What do you need from me? Right now? Nothing. Harry set down his own tea. I may need things later. Testimony, possibly. Specific documents. When I do, I'll ask directly. And I'd like direct answers. You'll have them, Dumbledore said. Harry stood. The meeting was over, and Dumbledore recognized it. He rose as well, with the small formality of someone acknowledging a shift in register, and collected Fawkes from the armchair. The Phoenix stepped onto his arm and regarded Harry with one orange eye that seemed to find the entire situation aesthetically satisfying. At the door, Dumbledore paused. Harry, the 5 motions. Are any of them related to Voldemort directly? One of them is, Harry said. The one about the suppression of evidence of his return. Dumbledore nodded slowly. Then you'll want to be careful. Not of the Ministry. Of him. He'll hear about the Wisengamot filing. He watches the formal channels, he has people there. I know, Harry said. I'm counting on it. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. Then he left, and the door closed, and Vernon came out of the kitchen holding a biscuit and looking like he desperately wanted to ask questions and had decided, wisely, against it. The Wisengamot clerk's office was in the Ministry of Magic, 3rd floor, administrative wing, and it had a specific variety of bureaucratic tranquility that Harry associated with rooms that had processed a great deal of consequential paperwork while pretending it was entirely routine. The clerk, a woman in her 50s named Griselda Marchbanks Hopwood, who Harry recognized dimly as someone from his OWL examinations the previous year, looked at Harry's notice of motion filing with an expression that began as neutral and traveled through several intermediate stages before settling on something he could only describe as professionally overwhelmed. Lord Potter-Black-Slytherin-Peverell, she said, because the filing required the use of the full title. She said it the way you'd say the name of a natural disaster, carefully, as though the saying of it might cause it to gather momentum. Plus Merlin, Harry said. Though I usually just go by Potter in casual settings. She looked at him. The Merlin title hasn't been active since the 6th century. I know. I claimed it last Thursday. She looked at the filing in her hands. She looked at Harry. She said, I'll need to verify the claim with Gringotts. I expected you would. They're expecting your owl. She verified it. It took 40 minutes, during which Harry sat in the corridor outside her office on a wooden bench and read the copy of Wizarding Governance that Hermione had lent him, and the young ministry assistant who had been sent to observe him, subtle about it, which meant he was standing by the water cooler 20 feet away and had not moved in 35 minutes, pretended to be looking at the notice board. When the verification came back, Marchbanks Hopwood opened her office door and her expression had achieved a kind of admirable stability, the professional serenity of a woman who had seen enough unusual things in 40 years of Wisengamot administration that she was not going to be the one who fell apart. The claim is verified, she said. Your motions are filed. Given your registered seat count, you have the right to call an emergency session, but the standard 14-day period applies unless you invoke that right. I'll take the 14 days, Harry said. I want people to have time to prepare. The session will be, she consulted her calendar, Monday the 27th. 9 o'clock. Thank you, Harry said. He stood, collected his book, and walked back down the corridor. The ministry assistant abandoned the water cooler and moved with great purpose in the opposite direction, which Harry found almost endearing. He took the lift to the atrium. The golden fountain was there, the witch and wizard and centaur and goblin and house elf in their monument to magical hierarchy, and Harry looked at it for a moment as he passed, the way he'd looked at it before in grief and shock and fear. He looked at it differently now. He saw it for what it was, a very expensive piece of self-congratulation, commissioned by people who had confused being at the top of a structure with having built the structure correctly. He walked past it and into the exit telephone box and pressed the button for street level, and stood in the rising darkness of the booth while London came to meet him. In his pocket, folded small, was a copy of the motion filing. 5 motions. He unfolded it and read it one more time, not because he'd forgotten what it said but because there was something about seeing it in official form, the ministry letterhead, the seal of the Wisengamot clerk, that made it real in a way that his own notes hadn't. Motion 1, the formal review of all trial records from Death Eater prosecutions 1979 to 1982, with particular regard to cases where conviction was secured without full evidentiary trial. Motion 2, the immediate public acknowledgement by the Ministry of Magic of the confirmed return of Lord Voldemort, Tom Marvolo Riddle, as evidenced by the events of the Triwizard Tournament, June 1995. Motion 3, the formal investigation of Hogwarts educational decree enforcement during the 1995-96 academic year, with reference to the documented use of blood quill detention by High Inquisitor Dolores Umbridge. Motion 4, the review and potential abolition of Dementor-administered imprisonment at Azkaban, on grounds of cruel and unusual punishment and violation of the Charter of Magical Rights, 1689. Motion 5, the constitutional review of ministry-appointed Wisengamot seats, with reference to the separation of legislative and executive powers as codified in the Statutes of Merlin, 1347. 5 motions. Each one a stone through a different window in the ministry's house of glass. Each one connected to the others. Each one, individually, possible to deflect or delay or deny. Together, in sequence, applied with the correct procedural force, not so easily managed. He folded it again and put it back in his pocket. The telephone box emerged into a quiet London side street in the mid-afternoon, and Harry stepped out and looked up at a sky that was finally clearing, the grey pressing back from the west and a strip of clear blue opening above the city's skyline. He thought, 14 days. He had work to do. What followed were the most intense 2 weeks of his life, and that was saying something considerable given that his previous benchmarks had included a basilisk, a dragon, and a cemetery full of Death Eaters. Hermione moved into the leaky cauldron for the duration, which she managed by telling her parents she was doing advanced academic research at the Diagon Alley Library, not entirely untrue, since they spent 6 to 8 hours a day there, surrounded by stacks of legal texts and historical records, and Hermione's research methods were aggressively comprehensive regardless of the context. Neville appeared 3 days into the fortnight with his Wisengamot registration completed and Augusta Longbottom's pointed approval radiating off him like a second-hand weather system. Augusta had also sent Harry a letter. It was 3 sentences. I understand you are filing motions before the Wisengamot. House Longbottom stands with House Potter in any such proceedings as involve the integrity of the law. Do not make me regret this. Harry wrote back, I won't. He also received letters he hadn't solicited. Some were from ancient houses, formal, careful acknowledgments of his lordship claims, the magical equivalent of being circled on a map. Some were from journalists, which he didn't answer. One was from Fudge's office, deeply formal and barely concealing what was, underneath the language, a fairly transparent threat dressed up as procedural advice. The minister wished to note that the upcoming session would be subject to normal Wisengamot protocols and that the submitting party should ensure all motions were in compliance with current ministry guidelines. Harry sent back a single line citing the specific statutory clause that gave him the right to table without ministerial endorsement, which Hermione had annotated with 3 references. The reply to that never came. The letter he hadn't expected was from Amelia Bones. He recognized the name, Bones, Susan's aunt, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, but he hadn't known much beyond that. The letter was on DMLE official parchment and it said, in handwriting that was precise and a little severe, Lord Potter. I have reviewed the Wisengamot filings of the 13th. I would like to meet with you before the session, in a capacity that is unofficial but not unserious. I have information that may be relevant to your motion 1. I also have questions. If you are willing, I suggest the Atrium Café, Tuesday the 24th, noon. It was signed the Bones, Director, DMLE. Harry read it twice. Then he wrote to Hermione, Amelia Bones wants to meet. What do you know about her? Hermione's response was back in 4 hours. Hermione on a research task was genuinely remarkable. Amelia Josephine Bones, Director of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement since 1994. Considered the most procedurally rigorous department head in the ministry, her office is known for by-the-book prosecution and has the lowest case dismissal rate due to improper procedure. She prosecuted Lucius Malfoy twice in the 80s, both times unsuccessfully due to political interference from above her head. She tried to press charges against Fudge's office in 2001 the Obliviation scandal and was blocked at ministerial level. She voted against the blood quill authorization for Umbridge's detention authority, she voted against it and was overruled. Harry. She's not the enemy. I think she's been waiting for someone to give her something to work with. Tuesday noon. The Atrium Café was a small, unremarkable place off the main concourse, the kind of institutional café that exists in every large building, weak tea, sandwiches and triangular packaging, a low magical hum from the overhead lighting. Amelia Bones was already there when Harry arrived, in plain robes without ministry insignia, and she was a solid, forthright-looking woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and small, wire-framed spectacles that made her look like she was permanently in the middle of reading something. She looked up when he sat down and didn't offer pleasantries. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for writing." Harry sat down. "You said you had information about motion 1. I do." She folded her hands on the table. "But first I want to understand who I'm talking to. You're 16 years old. 17 in 3 weeks. You filed 5 motions before the Wisengamot, 2 of which constitute direct political challenges to the current minister, and you've done it alone and without order backing and apparently without asking Dumbledore's permission." She studied him with the quality of someone who was very good at reading people and was choosing to be direct about doing it. "Either you're reckless or you know something I don't." "Probably both," Harry said. "What kind of answer would make you more confident?" That got a brief, involuntary twitch at the corner of her mouth. "A specific one." "Then here's a specific one. I know that motion 1 has teeth because I have access to the Gringotts genealogical records and the goblin legal assessment of the 1981-82 prosecutions, which found irregularities in 14 of the 23 cases tried that year. I know that motion 2 has teeth because I was there in the graveyard, I saw Voldemort return with my own body, and I have a Pensy-verified memory deposited with Gringotts that I'm prepared to enter into evidence. I know motion 3 has teeth because I have the scars on the back of my hand to prove it, and so do 11 other students who served detention with Umbridge." He held her gaze. "Motions 4 and 5 have more abstract teeth, but they're also the ones that matter most long-term. Does that answer your question?" Bones looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she reached into her briefcase and withdrew a folder. "Motion 1, she said. I have 3 additional cases you don't have. Internal DMLE files that I've been sitting on for 2 years waiting for an opportunity to enter them legally into the record. I can't table a motion myself, my position is executive, not legislative. But if your motion creates the conditions for a formal review, I can submit these files as evidence to that review." She slid the folder across to him, not all the way, she kept her fingers on the edge. "This isn't a political alliance. I'm not asking for anything in return. I'm doing what I should have been able to do 2 years ago if the process hadn't been blocked." Harry put his hand on the other side of the folder. He looked at her. "Is Fudge going to try to shut down the session?" he asked. "He'll try to control it," she said. He can't shut it down, you have procedural protection on the tabling. He knows that. What he'll do is challenge standing, challenge the Merlin claim, try to move procedural delays. She paused. He's also going to be angry, and when Fudge is angry he makes mistakes. That's actually when he's most dangerous, not because he thinks clearly, but because he stops thinking about optics and starts thinking about self-preservation, and in that mode he's capable of things he'd never try when he feels secure. I'll keep that in mind, Harry said. She let go of the folder. He picked it up. One more thing, she said. She looked at him with that direct, undecorated gaze. In the session. When they push back, and they will, don't let them make you into something you're not. The moment you start performing anger or performing certainty you don't have, they own the narrative. The moment you look like a 16-year-old boy with a grudge, half the chamber will write you off. She paused. Be exactly what you are. You're a legitimate lord with a legal right to be there and evidence to support every motion. That's not 16 years old. That's not a schoolboy. Act accordingly. Harry looked at her. You've thought about this a lot. I've thought about what it would take to change things in that chamber for about 15 years, Bones said, picking up her tea. I just didn't have the right pieces until now. The night before the Wisengamot session, Harry sat at his desk at Privet Drive and didn't read anything. He'd done the reading. He'd done the preparation. He'd met with Hermione 3 times in the last week and Neville twice and Bones once more, briefly, to go over procedural logistics. He'd reviewed the evidence sets. He'd practiced, in front of Hermione and with her merciless and invaluable interruptions, the way he intended to present each motion. He was ready. He opened the drawer of his desk and took out the photo of his parents, the one from the album Hagrid had made him at the end of first year, the one where they were young and alive and laughing in the summer somewhere, and Sirius was on one side of his father with one arm thrown around his shoulders. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about all the things he hadn't been given the right to know. He thought about how different it might have been, not just for him, but for all of them, if the law had done what it was supposed to do in the first place. He put the photo back. He thought, tomorrow it starts. He lay down and, after a while, slept. No nightmares. No visions. Just the deep, even sleep of someone who has made a decision and is done agonizing over it. In London, in the Ministry of Magic, a night security wizard walking the third-floor corridor paused by the Wisengamot chamber doors and looked at the session notice board, which had been updated that afternoon with the formal agenda for Monday's emergency session. The name at the top of the tabling list read, Lord H.J. Potter-Black-Slytherin-Peverell Merlin. The security wizard stared at it for a long moment. He'd been working this corridor for 12 years. He'd never seen that many names on one line before. He looked up and down the empty corridor, and then back at the board. He said, to no one, and went on with his rounds. Chapter 3, The floor of the Wisengamot. The Ministry of Magic at 8:30 on a Monday morning had the specific energy of a building that already knew something was going to happen and was pretending otherwise. Harry felt at the moment he stepped out of the telephone box into the atrium, a current running through the usual purposeful bustle, people moving with their heads slightly too straight, conversations dropping half a register as he passed. The golden fountain caught the overhead light and threw it in all directions, and the witches and wizards crossing the marble floor were dressed in their formal robes, because Wisengamot session days were formal, and several of them looked at Harry with expressions that ranged from open curiosity to the careful blankness of people who had been told by someone to be careful. He was wearing robes he'd never worn before. Gringotts had arranged them, or rather, Sharpax had arranged them without being asked, because the goblin had a pragmatic grasp of optics that Harry was coming to deeply appreciate. The Potter family vault had contained, among other things, a set of formal lordship robes that had been waiting in a preservation box for 35 years, deep charcoal wool with the Potter crest embroidered at the collar in gold thread, and worked into the inner lining, in a pattern only visible when the fabric moved, the crests of all 5 houses. They fit him. Of course they fit him. The preservation charm kept fabric against the measurements of the last person to wear them, and the last person to wear them had been James Potter, and James Potter and Harry were apparently, in skeleton and shoulder width and the specific length of their arms, the same person. Harry had stood in front of the mirror at the leaky cauldron wearing them and thought, I am not my father. And then, but I am his heir. And those two things, side by side, had felt for the first time like they could be true simultaneously without contradiction. Hermione was waiting by the lift with Neville. She was in her most severe set of robes, the dark plum ones that made her look like she was already a lawyer, and she had a leather satchel that clearly contained approximately a small library. Neville was in Longbottom formal robes, bottle green and well-fitted, with his grandmother's ancient house pin at his lapel. He looked, Harry thought, like someone who had decided once and for all to stop apologizing for taking up space. Augusta Longbottom stood beside him, formidable in black and silver, and she looked at Harry with the appraising expression of a general reviewing an unexpected ally. Lord Potter, she said, giving him the full title without inflection. A statement of fact. Lady Longbottom, Harry said. Thank you for coming. I've been waiting for a session worth attending for 9 years, she said crisply. Shall we go up? The Wizengamot chamber was on the 10th floor, below ground level like everything else in the ministry but insulated from that subterranean feeling by the scale of it, a great circular room with tiered seating rising on all sides and a central floor where the presenting party stood, and above the chamber a magical ceiling that showed an overcast sky. The seats were filling when they entered, and the sound was the particular sound of 73 people pretending to talk about nothing while thinking about something specific. Harry walked down the central aisle without stopping. He was aware of the eyes, there were a lot of them, and some of them were openly hostile and some were openly calculating and some were simply stunned, the reflexive surprise of people confronted with something they'd been told was impossible. He didn't acknowledge any of it. He walked to the presenting position at the center of the floor, set his folder of notes on the standing lectern, and looked up at the chamber. Fudge was in the ministerial box, a raised gallery to one side of the chamber, separate from the main seating, from which the minister could observe and address sessions without technically being a participant. He was already there when Harry entered, which Harry had expected. He was sitting very straight and his face was doing something complex, the carefully assembled pleasantness of a man managing a significant amount of internal panic. Beside him, Percy Weasley was positioned with a quill and parchment, taking pre-session notes with the diligent focus of someone who had decided the best way to navigate a difficult morning was to write everything down and think about it later. Dolores Umbridge was not present. She was, Harry happened to know from Amelia Bones, currently under administrative review within the ministry and had been advised not to attend Wizengamot sessions while that review was pending. The absence of her particular shade of pink was one of the more pleasant features of the room. The chief warlock's seat was occupied by a witch Harry didn't recognize, older, with the specific gravitas of someone who had been in this chamber long enough to have stopped being impressed by it. Her name, he knew from Hermione's notes, was Griselda Marchbanks, yes, the same Griselda from the clerk's office, wearing a different hat today, because in the wizarding world, apparently, the same person could administer both the procedural filing system and chair the highest legislative body, and no one had flagged this as a conflict. Marchbanks called the session to order at 9 exactly. This emergency session has been called by Lord H.J. Potter-Black-Slytherin-Peverell-Merlin, she announced, in a voice that carried without effort, under the provisions of the Wizengamot Procedural Act of 1739, Section 12, which grants any lord holding 3 or more registered seats the right to call an emergency session on matters of significant public concern. 5 motions have been filed and verified. We will proceed in the order in which they were filed. She looked at Harry. Lord Potter. You have the floor. The chamber went quiet. Not the polite quiet of procedural respect but the sharp, listening quiet of a room that wants to hear what comes next. Harry looked at his notes. Then he looked up, and left them where they were. I want to start, he said, with something simple. A fact. Tom Riddle, Voldemort, is alive. He returned in June of last year. I was there. I watched him kill Cedric Diggory with a killing curse, and I stood in the graveyard where he came back to full power, and I escaped by the skin of my teeth, and when I came back I told Dumbledore and I told the minister, and the minister chose to tell the prophet I was lying." He looked directly at Fudge, who met his gaze with the expression of a man discovering that his umbrella has a hole in it during a severe storm. "That's motion 2. That's where we'll start, because everything else, the trials, the imprisonment, the authoritarian education decrees, the way this ministry has been governed for the past year, all of it connects to the single fact that the man who caused the bloodiest decade in wizarding British history is back, and the people responsible for protecting this community decided that their political comfort was worth more than that truth." A sound ran around the chamber, not a protest, not agreement, something more complicated than either, the sound of 73 people recalibrating at slightly different speeds. "Objection." The voice came from the right side of the chamber, smooth and unhurried. Harry turned. Lucius Malfoy. He had a Wisengamot seat, family ancient, Malfoy, and he was sitting with the composed elegance of a man who had been in this room many times and had always found it manageable. His pale eyes moved over Harry with something that was almost clinical, as though Harry were a document he was assessing for weaknesses. "The presenting party is a minor with a history of instability. I would question whether the procedural standing granted by the claimed lordships is legitimate, given that several of those claims involve extraordinary historical titles whose verification requires more than a Gringotts registry. The claims have been verified by Gringotts under the Goblin Authentication Protocols of 1612, Harry said. Which, if you check your procedural handbook, are explicitly designated as primary source verification for inheritance claims in British wizarding law. You'll find that on page 47, Lord Malfoy." He paused. "Or I can have Sharpax come and explain it if you'd prefer." Malfoy's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, a slight contraction, the look of a man who has just registered that the opponent across the table knows exactly which moves are available and is not planning to be diverted by the first one. "The standing is valid," Marchbanks said, flatly. "Motion objected, Lord Malfoy. You can challenge on substantive grounds during the debate phase." "Lord Potter, continue." Harry continued. Motion 2 was the opening stone, and he had always known it would be the most emotionally volatile. He didn't lean into the emotion, he laid out the evidence with the same methodical care he'd brought to every preparation session in the past 2 weeks, the Pensy verified memory filed with Gringotts and submitted as exhibit, the eyewitness testimony from other participants at the third task, the Goblin forensic assessment of the dark mark strengthening patterns over the past year, and the piece that Amelia Bones had provided, the DMLE internal assessments from the past 8 months. That had been quietly documenting Death Eater activity increases and had not been shared with the minister's press office. Fudge spoke from the ministerial box during the first response period. He was composed, Harry gave him that, the man had real political instincts, and he understood that open hostility would read badly. His tone was measured and regretful, the tone of a man sadly constrained by facts. "The ministry's position on this matter has been consistent," Fudge said. "There is no verified evidence of the individual known as Voldemort returning in the way described. The events of the third task were tragic and have been fully investigated. The investigation took 6 weeks and produced a 12-page report," Harry said. "Cedric Diggory's parents received a letter of condolence. He received no official report at all, despite being the one who actually came back from the cemetery." He looked at Fudge. "Where is the full investigation file, Minister?" "The complete file, not the summary." A pause. Brief but perceptible. "That file is subject to ongoing review. I've submitted a formal evidence request under Wisengamot Rules Section 34, Harry said. Which requires full file disclosure within 7 days to a petitioning lord. I'm aware that means it won't be available today. But I want the chamber to note that the request has been made, and that 7 days from now, if the file is not produced in full, it constitutes an obstruction of Wisengamot proceedings, which is a criminal offense under the 1821 Governance Act." He looked at Marchbanks. "For the record." "Noted," Marchbanks said, writing. From the chamber seats, a sound, not quite laughter, not quite approval, a current of something, the recognizable sound of people watching a room change around them. Amelia Bones was in her seat in the executive observer gallery, not speaking. Her role in the session was observer only, by ministry protocol. But Harry caught her eye once, briefly, and she gave him a single, small nod that said, "Exactly right." He tabled motion 1 after the first recess, a 15-minute break at 10:30 during which Hermione pushed through the crowd to reach him and pressed a sheaf of updated notes into his hands. "Malfoy's been talking to 3 of the ancient house members," she said quietly. "I could see him from the gallery. He's working the right side of the chamber." "Who?" "Parkinson, Nott, Rosier. Ancient houses, all conservative, all voted against every blood status reform motion in the last decade." She looked at him. "They're not necessarily allies of his. They're people who are worried, and he's giving them a frame for that worry. He's telling them this is destabilization." "It is destabilization," Harry said. "That's the point. I know that and you know that. The question is whether they'll see it as the necessary kind." Hermione paused. "Neville's been talking to Appleton and Folly, they're both ancient houses, both nervous, neither of them Malfoy aligned. He's good, Harry. He's calm and he actually listens to them." Harry looked across the chamber where Neville was standing with 2 older witches, talking with the easy seriousness of someone who had grown up watching his grandmother work a room. "He should be on the floor with me," Harry said. "For motion 1, yes." Hermione hesitated. "There's something else. Percy Weasley's been watching you all morning and he looks like someone is slowly dismantling his entire worldview." Harry thought about Percy. Percy who had broken with his family over fudge, who had chosen the ministry when it had chosen comfort over truth, who had written to Ron last year with a letter that was simultaneously a warning and a capitulation. "That might actually be useful," he said. Motion 1 landed differently from motion 2. It was less visceral, it didn't have the raw emotional charge of standing in a room full of people and saying the thing you all agreed to disbelieve is true, but it was, in some ways, more dangerous. Because what it said, underneath the procedural language, was, the system that put people in Azkaban without trial was wrong, and the records prove it, and everyone in this room who has held a seat for the past 30 years had access to those records and chose not to look. He didn't say that out loud in those words. He didn't need to. He read the names of the 14 cases with irregular prosecution records, the ones from Sharpak's files, the 3 additional from Bones, and he put the Gringotts legal assessment on the record, and he asked for a full formal review panel to be constituted under independent oversight, not ministry oversight, and then he said, "I want to be specific about one case. Sirius Orion Black was imprisoned in Azkaban for 12 years for the murder of 12 Muggles and 1 wizard. He was never tried. He did not receive a hearing before this body or any court. He was not given the opportunity to present a defense. He was placed in Azkaban by administrative decision in November 1981 and he remained there until his escape in 1993. He looked at the chamber. Not at Malfoy, not at Fudge. At the full sweep of the seats, at the people in the middle, the people who hadn't yet decided what they thought about today. Sirius Black was innocent. He died last month. He died having never received justice from the institution that imprisoned him, and I am standing here today because he was my godfather and the legal guardian named in my parents' will, and if this system had worked the way it was supposed to work, if this body had done its job, he would have been alive to raise me, and my parents' wishes would have been honored, and a great deal of what has happened over the past 5 years would have happened differently." He paused. "I'm not saying that to be emotional. I'm saying it because it is a direct, documented consequence of this institution's failure. And if we are going to talk about reform, we start with naming what the failures actually cost." The chamber was very quiet. Then Neville was on his feet from his Longbottom seat. His voice was steady and clear. "I second motion 1 and I request that the review panel's remit explicitly include all cases where the defendant was imprisoned without formal trial, with particular reference to the full documentation of Death Eater prosecutions 1978 to 1984. Augusta Longbottom, from her observer seat, said nothing. But her expression was the expression of someone who had waited 20 years for this specific sentence to be spoken in this specific room. The chamber broke for lunch at 1. Harry had presented motions 1 and 2 and tabled 3, 4, and 5 for the afternoon session, and the room had the dazed, charged quality of somewhere struck by lightning. In the corridors outside the chamber, conversations that had been held in careful undertones were getting louder. Harry went to the small anteroom reserved for presenting parties and sat down with a glass of water and the quiet relief of someone who has been standing for a long time and is allowed, briefly, to stop. Hermione arrived approximately 90 seconds later, closely followed by Neville, and then by Augusta Longbottom, who closed the door behind her and looked at Harry with an expression that was about as warm as Augusta Longbottom's expressions got. "Well," she said. "You're your mother's son as much as your father's." Harry looked up. "Everyone says I look like my father." "You do," Augusta said. "But the way you just worked that chamber, the structure of it, the sequencing, the way you let the evidence carry the weight instead of your temper, that's Lily Evans Potter. She was 3 years behind me at Hogwarts and she argued a case in the Hogwarts inter-school legal debate in her 5th year that made a Hufflepuff 7th year cry with the sheer force of its logic." She sat down. "Don't waste the compliment. What's your strategy for the afternoon?" "Motion 3 first, the Umbridge case. That's the one with the most direct documentary evidence, the Scar testimony, the other students. It's also the one that makes Fudge most personally uncomfortable, because he signed the educational decrees." Harry ran through it quickly. "Motion 4, Azkaban, is the one where I lose some of the moderate houses, probably. It's genuinely divisive, and I'm not under any illusion that I'll get it passed today. What I need is enough votes to get a committee of inquiry constituted, and that's a lower bar." "And motion 5? Neville asked. "Motion 5 is the one Malfoy is most afraid of," Harry said. "Removing ministry-appointed seats from the Wizengamot is the structural change that would break the minister's control of the chamber permanently. It's the one that's hardest to pass and the one that matters most." He paused. "I don't think we pass it today. I think we get it into the record, we get it debated, we force every member of this chamber to go on record with a position. And then the war of public opinion begins, and we use what we've established today as the foundation." Augusta looked at him steadily. "You think long-term." "I've had to learn," Harry said. "Voldemort thinks in decades and so do his people. I've been reacting to short-term crises for 5 years. That's over." A knock at the anteroom door. Hermione opened it. Percy Weasley was standing in the corridor. He looked as though he'd been standing there for several minutes deciding whether to knock. He was in ministry formal robes and his expression was the expression of someone in the middle of the most uncomfortable reckoning of their adult life, which for Percy, Harry suspected, was saying quite a lot. Do you have a moment?" Percy said. He wasn't talking to Hermione. He was looking at Harry. Harry stood. "Yes." Hermione, Augusta, and Neville filed out past Percy with varying degrees of discretion, Augusta last, and she gave Percy a look on her way past that was not unkind but was extremely diagnostic. Percy came into the anteroom and shut the door and stood there with his hands at his sides. "I've been wrong," he said. Not preamble, not softening. The words of someone who had rehearsed them to the point where the only way to say them was direct. "About the ministry. About Fudge. About everything I said to my family last year." Harry looked at him. "I know. I knew about the blood quill authorization," Percy said. His voice had the flat, controlled quality of someone trying to maintain composure through a confession that is bigger than the room it's being made in. "I processed the paperwork. The educational decree that gave Umbridge disciplinary latitude, I helped draft the wording. I told myself it was administrative. That it was just procedure." He stopped. "You had scars on your hand from it." "Yes," Harry said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Percy said. "I'm not," This isn't that kind of conversation. He straightened. I have access to documents you don't. Internal ministry memos, interdepartmental correspondence about the decision not to disclose Voldemort's return, the full record of the Umbridge appointment including Fudge's personal notes on the rationale. I've been sitting on those because I didn't know what to do with them. He paused. I know what to do with them now. Harry looked at Percy Weasley, older than he'd seemed at the Burrow, stripped of the institutional certainty that had always been his armor, standing in an anteroom at the Ministry of Magic with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and the particular expression of someone who has finally decided to be someone their family would recognize, and felt something complicated and not unkind. Can you have them to me before the afternoon session? I have them with me, Percy said. He held up his satchel. Harry almost laughed. Of course you do. For the first time that morning, something in Percy's face broke open slightly, not a smile exactly, but the predecessor to one. Hermione would have copies made in under 5 minutes, he said. She really would, Harry agreed. The afternoon session was different. The morning had been a kind of controlled combustion, the motions landing, the chamber adjusting, the procedural machinery grinding into gear. The afternoon was faster, more volatile, the kind of energy a room gets when the first 3 hours have already broken the pretense that this is a routine session and now everyone is operating with their real positions visible. Motion 3 opened with a statement Harry had not planned on making, because Percy's documents had changed the picture considerably. He submitted the full Umbridge appointment file, Fudge's personal notes, the internal memo recommending the blood quills used be described as standard disciplinary equipment rather than specifically authorized, the chain of correspondence that showed the minister's office had known the blood quill was being used and had chosen not to intervene. I want to be clear about what these documents show, Harry said. Not that the ministry was ignorant of what was happening at Hogwarts. They show that the ministry was informed and made a deliberate administrative choice to allow it to continue. Students, some of them the children of people in this chamber, were subjected to a dark artifact that carved words into their skin as punishment for disagreeing with ministry policy. That is not an educational issue. That is torture. And the documents now in evidence show it was sanctioned at ministerial level. The sound from the chamber was not quiet this time. Fudge was on his feet in the ministerial box. The source of those documents is a ministry employee with full legal access to the files from which they came, Harry said. The source can be named and verified. The documents carry the original ministry authentication seals. If the minister wishes to challenge their authenticity, he is welcome to do so under oath before an evidentiary panel. He looked at Fudge directly. I would actually welcome that. A moment of absolute silence. Fudge sat down. In the gallery, Amelia Bones put her pen down on the desk in front of her, the slow, deliberate motion of someone who has just watched a year's worth of blocked investigations be entered into the public record in 45 minutes. Motion 3 passed. Not overwhelmingly, 38 to 31, with 4 abstentions, but passed, and the formal investigation into Dolores Umbridge's conduct at Hogwarts was constituted, with Amelia Bones formally named as investigation lead on the motion of 3 independent lords. There was a 5-minute procedural break to allow the recording clerk to catch up, during which Lucius Malfoy leaned over and had a short, inaudible conversation with Lord Nott, and the expression on Malfoy's face had subtly changed. It was still controlled, still composed, but there was something at the edges of it, a kind of recalculating that Harry had seen before. He'd seen it in Draco Malfoy's face in the corridor outside the defense classroom in 4th year, and he recognized what it was, the expression of someone who has been playing a game and has just realized the other player isn't playing the same game at all. Motion 4, Azkaban, was the one Harry had told Neville would be divisive, and he was right. He argued it with the same methodical care, citing the Charter of Magical Rights, presenting Goblin historical records of the Dementor Accords and their original terms, and making the substantive point that imprisonment administered by creatures that fed on human happiness was not, in any coherent moral framework, a legitimate criminal justice instrument. He lost the initial vote, 24 for, 42 against, 7 abstentions. He had expected that, and it didn't shake him. He requested, under his procedural right as a 5-seat lord, that the motion be referred to a standing committee for formal review rather than closed, which was a different motion and passed 39 to 33, because voting for a committee was easier than voting for abolition and gave the moderate houses something they could take back to their families and call prudence. "That's a win," Neville said quietly, when Harry returned to the presenting position after the procedural vote. "It's the beginning of a win," Harry said. "Which is better than nothing, and nothing was the only other option today." Motion 5 was last. The chamber was tired by then, not inattentive, but running on the compressed attention of people who had been processing significant things for several hours and were now down to their intellectual reserves. Harry looked at the chamber and thought, this is actually the right state. People made honest decisions when they were tired of pretending. He argued Motion 5, the constitutional review of ministry-appointed seats, with particular precision, because it was the most structurally complex motion and the one most likely to be lost on procedural confusion if he was vague. He cited the statutes of Merlin 1347, which had established the Wisengamot's independence from executive interference, and the Ministerial Authority Act of 1811, which had created the appointed seats as a temporary wartime measure that had somehow persisted for over a century. He cited the voting record of the 14 ministry-appointed seats over the past 30 years and noted that they had voted against the sitting minister exactly 0 times on any substantive issue. The Wisengamot is supposed to be independent of executive authority, he said. That's not radical. That's what it says in the founding documents of this body. The ministry-appointed seats were a wartime exception that became permanent through inertia, and they have been used, consistently and measurably, to give every sitting minister effective control over the legislature. I'm not saying every person in one of those seats is corrupt. I'm saying the mechanism is, because it makes genuine legislative independence impossible. He paused. This motion calls for a constitutional review, not immediate abolition, not reconstruction from scratch, but a formal, independent review of whether these seats are consistent with the foundational principles of Wisengamot governance. That is a minimal ask. If people in this chamber vote against even a review of whether the current structure is appropriate, I would invite them to explain why they think a legislature controlled by the executive is something that needs defending. Motion 5 failed to pass. 29 for, 42 against, 4 abstentions. But the Constitutional Review Committee, which was a separate procedural motion, under the same principle Harry had used for Motion 4, passed by 35 to 33. A margin of 2 votes. Harry stood at the lectern and watched the count displayed on the chamber board, and did not allow himself to show anything on his face. 2 votes. Months of stagnation broken by 2 votes. The beginning of something that could become, in time, the structural overhaul that needed to happen for any of the rest to work. Marchbanks called the session to close. The formal record was read back. 3 investigations constituted. 2 review committees established. 1 evidence request filed against the minister's office with a 7-day compliance deadline. Every motion publicly debated, publicly voted on, publicly recorded. Harry gathered his notes. Around him, the chamber was breaking into the particular chaos of a room where something significant has just happened and everyone needs to talk to someone about it before they can properly process it. Voices were loud, the acoustics reflecting everything back doubled. Fudge left the ministerial box without looking at Harry. Which was, Harry thought, about right. Malfoy descended from his seat and crossed the chamber floor and stopped 3 feet from Harry. His 2 companions, not, Crabbe Sr., had fanned out slightly to either side, not threatening, just present, the way Malfoy's people always arranged themselves. That was very competent, Malfoy said. His tone was precisely calibrated, not hostile, not conceding, something smooth and unreadable between them. Thank you, Harry said. You'll find, Malfoy said, that committees and reviews can be a very effective way of putting things somewhere safe where they don't cause trouble. A great many important things have been committed to death over the years. I know, Harry said. That's why I filed the evidence with Gringotts, not with the committees. The committees are on the record, but the evidence is under goblin protection, which means it can't be lost, buried, or quietly retired. And Gringotts' evidence enters automatically into the legal record of any subsequent criminal prosecution. He held Malfoy's gaze. So the committees are just the public face. The documentation is already where it needs to be. A silence. Malfoy's expression did something very small and very controlled, and it was the most honest thing Harry had seen on his face in 5 years. "Interesting," Malfoy said. And walked away. Outside the ministry, in the early evening, Hermione grabbed Harry's arm the moment they were clear of the building. "You didn't tell me about the Gringotts evidence filing," she said. "I did it this morning, before we came in," Harry said. "I didn't want it in the notes in case the notes were seen. I asked Sharpax by Owl 3 days ago and he confirmed it was possible." "Harry." She stared at him. That's brilliant." "Hermione Granger calling something brilliant that isn't her own work," Neville said, from behind them. "I'm marking the date." She turned to give Neville a look that was somewhere between amused and affronted. He gave her back the mild, genuine smile of someone who isn't remotely concerned. 3 investigations, 2 committees, Harry said. "It's not enough. It's not close to enough. But it's on the record now, which means it's real, and you can't unreality things once they're on the record." They stood on the Muggle Street outside the ministry entrance, the summer evening going gold around them, London carrying on its enormous ordinary life. Harry looked up at the darkening sky. He thought about Fudge's face in the ministerial box, that moment, after Harry had offered the evidentiary panel challenge, when Fudge had sat down. Not because he'd been defeated. Because he'd done the calculation and understood that the ground had shifted, and that the instruments he'd always used to manage difficult situations, ministry protocol, procedural delay, the comfortable weight of institutional inertia, were not going to work the same way on this particular problem. Voldemort knew by now. He'd have someone in the chamber, probably not, possibly one of the administrative staff in the recording clerk's office. By tonight, the word would be through his network that Harry Potter had walked into the Wizengamot and begun dismantling the ministry's credibility from the inside, legally, and that the ministry could not stop him without making itself look worse. Harry had counted on that too. Voldemort needed the ministry weak and discredited as a separate agenda item. His long-term plan had always included removing the institutional obstacles to his own power. Harry was removing those same obstacles for different reasons, and the 2 agendas would look, from the outside, superficially aligned, right up until the moment they weren't. That moment was coming. Harry had a plan for it. "Food," Neville said. "I haven't eaten since the lunch recess and I'm fairly certain I made at least one voting decision based on low blood sugar." "You voted correctly on everything," Hermione said. "I know, but I want to eat something anyway." Harry laughed. He laughed properly, fully, the way he hadn't in weeks, and the sound of it surprised him a little. It came from somewhere that had been closed for a while, somewhere that was, tentatively, carefully, beginning to open. "Right," he said. "Food. Then we plan the next 14 days. Hermione opened her mouth. Harry pointed at her. "After food," he said. "I was just going to suggest the Italian place in the alley," she said, with dignity. "Sure you were." They walked, the 3 of them, into the warm summer evening. Behind them, the Ministry of Magic sat in its underground home beneath the London streets, its fluorescent lights burning white over a chamber where the transcription clerks were still writing, capturing every word of what had happened that afternoon, making it permanent, making it real. The record was made. The rest was consequence. Chapter 4, What Laws Were Made for the Prophet ran the story on Tuesday morning. Harry read it at a corner table in the leaky cauldron with a plate of toast he was mostly ignoring and the particular quality of attention you give something you've been waiting for and are finally allowed to see. The headline was, Potter Tables 5 Motions, Ministry in Chaos. The question mark doing significant work, a classic Skeeter hedge, preserving plausible neutrality while loading every word before it. The byline wasn't Skeeter, though. It was a reporter he didn't recognize, a Barnabas Cuff byline that meant the editor himself had taken the story, which was its own kind of signal. The article was, by Prophet standards, almost accurate. It got the motion numbers right. It got the umbrage detail right. It stumbled on the Wisengamot arithmetic, describing Harry as holding several seats, rather than 5, which might have been ignorance or might have been a quiet editorial choice to avoid committing to a number that would raise its own questions, and it described Fudge's response as measured, which Harry thought was generous, but the overall shape of it was fair enough. At the bottom, attributed to an anonymous ministry source, today's session was unprecedented. Whether Lord Potter's motions represent genuine reform or political destabilization is a matter of perspective. Hermione appeared at his elbow and read the last line over his shoulder. Anonymous ministry source, she said. Percy, Harry said. Probably. She sat down. Not a bad quote, actually. It's neutral enough that it sounds objective and specific enough that it sounds informed. He's learning. He always knew how to do that, Harry said. He just used to use it for Fudge. She poured herself tea. She had her research bag with her, which meant she had already been somewhere before the leaky cauldron this morning, and her expression had the quality it got when she had found something and was deciding how to present it. Harry knew that expression very well. What did you find? He said. Something Amelia Bones mentioned in passing at the meeting last week, she said. About the Dementor Accords, the original ones, from 1295. She said the ministry's version of the Accords was abridged. I went to the Wizarding Archive on Chancery Lane this morning at 7:30 and asked to see the full text. And? Hermione opened her bag and produced a sheaf of parchment covered in her cramped, intent handwriting. The abridged version removes 3 clauses entirely. Clause 7, which explicitly prohibits Dementors from operating within 50 miles of a human settlement of any kind, including magical ones, without a signed agreement from the resident community. Clause 9, which requires annual review of any Dementor deployment by an independent oversight body. And Clause 11, she paused for effect, which she never did unless the effect was warranted, which states that any magical governing authority found in breach of Clauses 7 or 9 forfeits the right to negotiate with Dementor colonies unilaterally, and that all existing Dementor agreements become void and subject to renegotiation. Harry put down his toast. The ministry has been in breach of Clauses 7 and 9 since approximately 1890, Hermione said. Azkaban is on an island off the northern Scottish coast. It is 43 miles from the nearest inhabited landmass, which puts it within range under Clause 7. And the annual oversight review has not occurred once since records began. So the Dementor agreements are void, Harry said. Technically, under the original Accords, yes. Which means the Ministry's authority over the Dementor colony is not grounded in any valid contract. Which means every deployment of Dementors since 1890, including their use at Azkaban, was conducted without legal authority. She looked at him. Motion 4's committee just got significantly more powerful. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then, can you have that written up as a formal legal brief by tomorrow? I started it on the bus, she said, pulling out a second sheaf. He looked at her for a long moment with the very specific feeling of someone who has been unreasonably lucky in their choice of friends. Hermione. You are extraordinary. I know, she said, without the slightest self-consciousness. More toast. The Bones meeting was at noon. She was already there when Harry arrived, the same cafe, the same table, but the dynamic had shifted since their first meeting. Last time, she had been assessing him. This time, when she looked up, it was with the expression of someone who has been in communication with a colleague rather than evaluating a prospect. There was a file on the table in front of her, thicker than the one she'd brought before. The Umbridge investigation is formally opened, she said, without preamble, as he sat. I've got investigators on it. The blood quill evidence is solid, 11 students corroborated in writing, and I've identified 3 more since the session who were either too frightened to come forward before or didn't know there was a process. She paused. There's something else. The investigation into the educational decrees opened a line I didn't expect. The decree authorization paperwork was signed by Fudge, but the legal framework that allowed him to sign it, the emergency powers provision he used, was expanded by a ministerial order in July of 1995. Quietly. Very little fanfare. It wasn't the kind of thing that made the papers. Who drafted the expansion? Harry asked. The Office of Magical Law, she said. Specifically, a senior solicitor named Cornelius Hopkirk. She watched his face. He's Fudge's cousin. Of course he is, Harry said. The ministerial order expanding emergency powers also, incidentally, expanded the minister's discretion over Wisengamot session scheduling, the classification of magical creatures, and, she tapped the file, the authorization protocol for Azkaban prisoner transfers. Harry thought about that. Prisoner transfers meaning the minister can authorize moving prisoners without Wisengamot oversight. Which is how, in 1997, if Voldemort continues to gain ground, which our intelligence currently suggests is a meaningful risk, he or anyone who replaces him could move all the right people out of Azkaban quietly, without a session, without debate. She looked at him steadily. I want that ministerial order repealed. Add it to the record on Motion 5, Harry said. The Constitutional Review Committee, if you can get me the order text and the Gringotts legal assessment of its validity, I can enter it as supplementary evidence to the committee's remit. Already requested, she said. Gringotts' legal department has been remarkably forthcoming. They're invested in legal clarity, Harry said. In my experience, that's not always for altruistic reasons, but it has the same practical effect. She smiled at that, brief, dry, the smile of someone who has been dealing with goblin bankers for 30 years and finds this observation accurate. There's a broader political problem, she said, and her voice shifted slightly, the dry warmth going back to the directness that was her natural register. You've opened 4 lines of investigation and 2 constitutional reviews. You have the evidentiary filings with Gringotts that make those untouchable. You've got Motion 2 sitting with a 7-day compliance deadline that Fudge has not met and cannot meet without producing documents that will make his position untenable. She paused. He knows this. Fudge is not stupid, Harry. He's self-interested to a degree that compromises his judgment, but he's a competent political operator. He will be planning something. What kind of something? The kind that doesn't look political from the outside. She folded her hands. He's used the impropriety angle before, trying to have young or unconventional voices dismissed on grounds of instability or improper conduct. He tried it with me in 2001. He'll try it with you. She met his eyes. I'd be very careful about anything you do publicly in the next 2 weeks. Anything that could be characterized as reckless, unstable, dangerous. He only needs one incident. Harry thought about the suppression charms. About his magical core, unsuppressed and still largely unexplored, sitting in him like a depth he hadn't yet fully sounded. He won't get one, he said. No, she agreed. I don't think he will. But I wanted you to know the terrain. He spent the afternoon in Diagon Alley, deliberately visible. He sat in Florian Fortescue's with a butterscotch cone he didn't particularly need and let people see him, not performing, not projecting, just being present in an ordinary way in an ordinary place. It had occurred to him the night before, lying awake thinking about Bones's warning, that the best counter to Fudge's impropriety narrative was simple, consistent public visibility, Harry Potter, sitting in a cafe, reading a legal text, greeting people he recognized. Not a revolutionary. Not a dangerous radical. Just a person going about their day, who happened to also be dismantling the ministry's legal architecture in his spare time. 3 people approached him in 2 hours. A witch he didn't know who introduced herself as Lady Greengrass, older, sharp-eyed, the head of a house he vaguely associated with Slytherin, who sat across from him briefly and said, in carefully modulated tones, that House Greengrass was watching the constitutional proceedings with interest and that several of the moderate ancient houses had been discussing an informal coordination. Harry told her he was open to discussion and gave her Hermione's name as a contact, and she left with the expression of someone who had anticipated a longer conversation and found the shorter one more impressive. The second was a reporter, not the Prophet, a newer publication called the Quibbler's Political Supplement, who asked if he would consent to a formal interview. He said yes, on the condition that he approved the final text before publication. She agreed. The third was a man he didn't recognize who sat down without asking, looked at him with the focused intensity of someone delivering a message, and said, "Lord Voldemort wishes you to know that he is watching your work in the Wizengamot with considerable interest." Harry looked at him. He was young, 20, maybe, nondescript, with the look of someone who had been pointed at a destination and told not to stop. Not a Death Eater. A messenger. "Tell him," Harry said, "that I know." He picked up his book. "And tell him that if he wants to send me messages, owls exist and I read them." The messenger left. Harry finished his cone. He wasn't afraid. He found this interesting, not the absence of fear as numbness, not the false calm of dissociation, but genuine clarity. He had been afraid of Voldemort for 5 years in the reflexive, pre-rational way you're afraid of the dark, not because you've assessed the threat and found it overwhelming, but because you've been told, repeatedly and emphatically, that this is the thing to be afraid of. Now he had assessed the threat. The assessment was, Voldemort was powerful, genuinely dangerous, and in possession of a strategic mind that had been operating at scale for decades. He was also, however, a man who had fragmented his own soul in pursuit of immortality, who had no institutional legitimacy, whose movement was built on terror rather than loyalty, and who was watching Harry's Wizengamot strategy with interest because it was accomplishing things his own brute force approach never could. He was afraid of Harry Potter in the way that ideologues are afraid of due process, not because they can't fight it, but because they can't use it. That was something. Neville met him at 7 that evening at the Leaky Cauldron, and he arrived with a copy of Wizarding Governance tucked under his arm and the specific animation of someone who has been thinking for several hours and has reached a conclusion. "The Longbottom sealed files," he said, dropping into the chair across from Harry. "The Death Eater trial records. I sent the formal request to the Ministry Archive on Monday, after the session. I got back a form letter saying the records were restricted under the 1982 Security Classification Act." He put a folded document on the table. "I looked up the 1982 Security Classification Act." Harry looked at him. "There is number 1982 Security Classification Act," Neville said. "There are security classification provisions in the 1978 Emergency Powers Act, which expired in 1989, and there's a 1991 Data Protection Framework, but there is no standalone Security Classification Act of 1982. He paused. "They cited a law that doesn't exist." Harry looked at the letter. Then at Neville. Then he started to laugh. "They cited a fake law," he said. "To restrict access to files that probably contain evidence that would be devastating to their record on Death Eater prosecutions." Neville's expression was mild and absolutely certain. "I want to enter this into the record for Motion 1's review panel. A Ministry Archive letter citing a non-existent statute as grounds for restricting access to potentially exculpatory evidence in cases involving wrongful imprisonment." "Neville," Harry said. "Yes. Have I mentioned that I'm very glad you're doing this?" Neville considered. "You can tell me again." "I don't mind." Percy Weasley's first proper act of useful sedition occurred on Wednesday afternoon, and it came in the form of a package. It arrived at the Leaky Cauldron via internal ministry courier, the magical equivalent of a secure document delivery service, the kind that left no external owl trail. The package was wrapped in standard ministry brown paper and labeled research materials requested by Lord Potter-Black regarding historical Wizengamot proceedings, which was technically accurate if you accepted a fairly generous definition of requested. Harry had mentioned in Percy's presence 3 days ago that he wanted to understand how the 1811 Ministerial Authority Act had passed originally, And Percy had apparently taken this as a commission. Inside was a set of documents that made Hermione, reading over Harry's shoulder, go very still for several seconds. "Percy," she said, with an expression that suggested she was revising several opinions simultaneously. The documents were internal ministry correspondence from 1811, pulled from the deep archive. They showed, in the handwriting of 3 ministers and 7 senior ministry officials, the deliberate and premeditated creation of the appointed seats, not as a wartime measure, as the official history claimed, but as an explicit and admitted mechanism to ensure appropriate ministerial oversight of legislative proceedings that might otherwise produce outcomes inconsistent with executive policy. One letter, from the minister of the time to a colleague, was quite specifically unambiguous: "If we allow the hereditary lords to vote freely without counterweight, we will spend the next century undoing legislation we cannot afford to undo. The appointed seats are not elegant, but they are necessary." "That's an admission," Harry said. "That the appointed seats were created specifically to compromise Wizengamot independence, and that the people who created them knew it." "That is an admission," Hermione agreed. "And it's 200 years old, which means the people who defended those seats on Monday in good faith, the ones who genuinely thought they were a legitimate governance structure, were defending something that was documented as corrupt at its own founding." "Yes," Hermione said. "And the people who knew that and defended it anyway are in a rather different position." Harry looked at the letter. He thought about Fudge, who was not stupid, who had been in this system for 30 years and had risen to its top, and who therefore almost certainly understood, maybe not the specifics of this letter, but the essential mechanism, the way the appointed seats worked, the function they served. He thought about what it meant to know the system was built wrong and choose to operate it anyway, because the wrongness was useful to you. He picked up his quill and began drafting the supplementary brief for Motion 5's review committee. The compliance deadline on Motion 2, the 7-day evidence request for the full investigation file on Cedric Diggory's death and the events of the third task, expired on Monday morning. Nothing arrived. Harry sent the formal non-compliance notice to the Wizengamot clerk at 9:15, citing the 1821 Governance Act, and the clerk, Marchbanks Hopwood, who had by now achieved a sort of weary professionalism about the entire situation, sent back a confirmation of receipt within the hour. The non-compliance was on the record. Under the Act, it triggered an automatic referral to the Wizengamot's Judicial Oversight Panel, which was, inconveniently for Fudge, chaired by a lord who was not in any way affiliated with the minister's bloc. "He didn't produce the file," Hermione said, when Harry told her. She was already looking at the procedure manual. "He must know what's in it." "He knows what's in it," Harry said. "That's why he didn't produce it. But not producing it is a criminal offense now. Under the referral, the oversight panel can order production. If he resists that order, it escalates to contempt of the Wizengamot, which is a judicial matter, which means it goes to the Wizengamot's own judicial committee, which is independent of the minister." Harry leaned back. "He's painted himself into a corner. If he produces the file, it contains evidence he doesn't want public. If he doesn't produce it, the non-compliance process is going to generate enough procedural and legal noise that the question of why he's not producing it becomes a story all by itself." Hermione was quiet for a moment. "He might try to have the file destroyed or modified." "Bones has a copy," Harry said. "She's had one since July. She told me on Saturday." "Harry." Hermione looked at him. "How many pieces of this did you have in place before the session?" "Most of them," he said honestly. "The session was the beginning of the visible part. The invisible part has been running for 2 weeks." She stared at him. "You didn't tell me all of it." "I told you everything I needed help with," he said. "The rest was," he thought about it. "The rest was things I needed to do myself. Not because I didn't trust you. Because some of it was personal and I needed to do it without it becoming a collaborative project. The evidence filing with Gringotts, the Percy conversation, the Bones back channel. Those were mine to do." She was quiet. He knew her well enough to know what she was doing, assessing whether she was hurt, finding that she wasn't exactly hurt but that there was something adjacent to it, and working out whether the adjacent thing was reasonable. "You could have told me after," she said, finally. "You're right," he said. "I should have. I'm telling you now." A pause. "All right," she said. "Don't do it again." "I'll try." She picked up the procedure manual. "The oversight panel convenes next Thursday," she said, "back to business, the adjacent thing filed away for a later conversation. I want to have a full procedural brief ready for whoever chairs it." "I'll be there," Harry said. "I assumed," she said. The letter from Voldemort arrived on Thursday. Not a messenger this time, an actual letter, delivered by a bird Harry didn't recognize, something large and black that landed on his windowsill at Privet Drive at 3 in the morning, presented the letter with the hauteur of a creature that found the entire errand beneath it, and left. The letter was written in a fine, precise hand on parchment that felt slightly wrong under his fingers, the way all objects connected to Voldemort felt slightly wrong, like something about them was trying to edge away from the categories of normal things. "Lord Potter, your activities in the Wizengamot are noted. You are doing, with considerable competence, something I have spent decades attempting to achieve through less elegant means. You are demonstrating that the Ministry of Magic is institutionally corrupt and structurally incapable of serving the community it nominally represents. I find myself in the peculiar position of observing that your methods are, in their way, superior to my own. I am not writing to threaten you. I have no interest in killing you at this particular moment. You are more useful alive and in opposition to Fudge than dead and martyr to his narrative. I am writing because I believe you are intelligent enough to recognize that we have, temporarily, aligned interests. The ministry must fall. We differ only on what should replace it. I will not interfere with your current proceedings. I expect the same courtesy." TMR Harry read it twice. Then he sat at his desk and wrote a reply. "Dear Tom, thank you for the letter. I appreciate the directness. You're right that we've been working toward the same short-term outcome, and I'd be dishonest if I pretended otherwise. But I want to be clear about something, since you've chosen to be direct. What I'm building is the opposite of what you want. I'm not trying to create a vacuum. I'm trying to replace a corrupt structure with a functional one. Rule of law. Independent oversight. Due process. Rights that apply to everyone, including Muggle-borns, half-bloods, non-humans, and everyone else your movement has spent decades targeting. If the ministry falls the way I'm working toward, what replaces it is better governance. Not a power vacuum. Not a Dark Lord. Not blood purity enforced at one point. So no, I won't be offering you courtesy of non-interference. I'll be opposing you just as actively as I've been opposing Fudge, and for the same reason. You're both problems that need solving, and I intend to solve them in the correct order. Regards, Harry Potter. He sent it back with Hedwig. He watched her disappear into the pre-dawn darkness and thought, let him think about that. He wasn't naive about what the letter meant. Voldemort's offer of non-interference was exactly as valuable as any agreement made with someone who had fragmented their soul and considered human life a tactical consideration. Harry had not accepted it and had been clear about why. The important thing was that the letter existed, and that he had a copy of it, and that the copy was going to Gringotts in the morning, in the evidence file. Because if Voldemort was watching the Wizengamot proceedings, he had people in the ministry watching them. And if Harry could prove that, if there were Death Eater sympathizers in the ministry who had been feeding information to Voldemort's network while also sitting in on Wizengamot proceedings and potentially influencing them, that was the piece that connected Motion One's review of old trials with the present day in a way that was impossible to ignore. Amelia Bones met him at the archive on Friday morning with the expression of someone who has been up since 5. Dolores Umbridge, she said, before he'd sat down. What about her? My investigators ran the full investigation of her conduct at Hogwarts as constituted by Motion 3. Bones dropped a file on the table between them. The blood quill is the most visible part. But there's more. She confiscated correspondence between students and their families. She interfered with student mail, outgoing and incoming, under authority she did not have and did not seek. She attempted, in March of this year, to use an illegal interrogation curse on a student. She paused. On you, specifically, in the headmaster's office. Harry thought about the forest. About the centaurs. About Umbridge's voice going from saccharine to something naked and ugly in the span of 30 seconds when she thought she was winning. I remember. I need a formal statement from you, she said. Pensy verified, submitted to the investigation file. Along with statements from anyone else who was present. She paused. Given that what she attempted was an illegal curse on a minor, this is no longer just an educational conduct investigation. It's a criminal matter. What will happen to her? If the full evidence holds up, and it will, I'll make sure of it, she'll be prosecuted under the Improper Use of Magic Act and the Custodial Abuse provisions of the Education Charter. She'll lose her position, her ministry credentials, probably her wand. Bones paused. And she won't be the end of it. The pattern of authorization, Fudge's sign-offs, Hopkirk's legal framework, the chain of documented approval for what she was doing, that builds a case for ministerial abuse of power that goes well beyond Umbridge personally. Harry thought about the scar on his hand. I must not tell lies, in his own writing, carved there by a quill that used his blood as ink. He thought about the other students who had come forward, 11 of them, and the 3 more Bones had found, and the ones who probably hadn't come forward yet. I'll give you the statement today, he said. There's something else, Bones said. She sat down and folded her hands and looked at him with the expression she wore when she was about to say something that she had thought about carefully before deciding to say. The political situation. Fudge's non-compliance on the evidence request, the oversight panel convenes next week. That's going to be messy. He has allies who will try to delay, challenge jurisdiction, raise procedural objections. It could take months even if we win every argument. I know. What I want to say is this, there is a version of the oversight panel hearing where Fudge is found in contempt, the process grinds through the courts, and it takes 2 years to resolve. During those 2 years, Voldemort is recruiting, people are getting hurt, and the ministry is paralyzed by its own corruption proceedings. She paused. And there is another version. Where the hearing produces enough public evidence, on the record, that the pressure on the ministry becomes unsustainable. Where people inside the ministry start making decisions for themselves rather than for Fudge. Where the weight of what's been documented simply, she looked for the right word, lands. You're talking about a no-confidence vote, Harry said. I'm talking about the conditions under which one might become possible, she said carefully. I'm not talking about political maneuvering. I'm talking about what happens when a public institution is confronted with a comprehensive, documented, properly evidenced record of its own failure, and the people inside it are given permission by that record to respond honestly. Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about all the people in the ministry who were not Fudge, the administrative staff, the junior officials, the Aurors, the researchers, the people who came in every morning and did their jobs and told themselves the problems were above their pay grade. He thought about the weight that pressed down on anyone inside a corrupt institution, the normalizing effect of it, the way you learned to stop seeing the wrongness because the wrongness was everywhere and there wasn't a clean edge to stand on. And he thought about what it might feel like to be given a clean edge. To be given evidence, and permission to look at it, and the knowledge that you were not alone in having looked. The hearing is Thursday, he said. I'll be prepared. I know you will. She paused. Neville Longbottom is good, by the way. He has the deposition format for the trial records motion worked out better than most second-year lawyers I've encountered. Don't tell him that, Harry said. Augusta will never let any of us hear the end of it. Bones smiled, properly this time, the full version. I'll keep it to myself. On Saturday, Harry went back to Grimmauld Place. He hadn't been since before the Department of Mysteries. The house was his now, legally, unambiguously, under the Black Will, and it had been standing empty for the past month. The Order had largely vacated it after Sirius died, the particular silence of a place that had been a gathering point and was no longer one radiating from every room. He let himself in with the black family ring. Sharpax had sent it with a note that said simply as it should be, and stood in the hallway. The black family tapestry was on the wall. Mrs. Black's portrait was behind the curtains, silent and still because she only screamed when the curtain moved. The hall smelled of old stone and the ghost of every meal Molly Weasley had ever made in that kitchen. He went upstairs, slowly, to the room Sirius had used. It was modest, the smallest bedroom in the house, as though even in his own home Sirius had felt the need to take up as little space as possible, the habit of Azkaban and before that a childhood in this house that had never been comfortable. There was a Gryffindor pennant tacked somewhat crookedly to the wall above the desk, and a photograph on the desk, Sirius and James Potter, 20 years old and laughing about something, and beside them a young Remus Lupin with his hands in his pockets and an expression like someone perpetually surprised by his own happiness. Harry picked up the photograph. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it for a while. He thought about Sirius in the Department of Mysteries. The way he'd moved, all that coiled energy, finally let off the leash, fighting with the reckless joy of someone who had been caged too long and for whom the movement itself was a kind of answer. He thought about the veil. He thought, you would have hated all of this. You would have hated the paperwork and the legal briefs and the Wisengamot procedure and the careful measured strategy of it. You would have wanted it to be louder, faster, more of a fight. But you would have loved that it was working. He put the photograph down gently, straightened it, and stood up. He went back downstairs to the kitchen, where the long table sat in the cool underground light, and he sat down at the head of it, the seat that had been Dumbledore's and before that probably Sirius's in some contested, awkward way, and took out the notes he'd brought with him. He thought about the oversight panel hearing on Thursday. He thought about what Bones had said about the two versions of how it could go. He thought about Percy's documents, and Hermione's archive findings, and Neville's non-existent statute, and the Voldemort letter in the Gringotts evidence file, and the 11 students with scars on their hands. He thought about weight. The accumulated, documented, on-the-record weight of all of it, and whether it was enough, and what enough would actually look like. Then he thought about one more thing, a thing he hadn't told Hermione or Neville or Bones yet, because he hadn't been sure until today that it was the right move. He picked up his quill. He wrote a letter to Cornelius Fudge. Not a legal notice. Not a procedural filing. A letter, personal and direct, 3 paragraphs, and what it said was this: Harry knew about the Hopkirk legal framework and the ministerial order and the appointed seats document. Harry knew about the non-compliance and what it meant. Harry was not looking to destroy anyone personally. Harry was looking for the ministry to function, and the simplest path to that outcome was a minister who chose, voluntarily, to cooperate with the oversight process rather than obstruct it. This cooperation could look like many things: full document production, voluntary recusal from certain committees, support for specific reform measures, and Harry was willing to discuss what it might look like. This offer had a time limit, which was the opening of the oversight panel on Thursday. He read it back. Then he added one more line at the end: I want to be clear that this is not a threat. It is an offer. The difference matters to me, and I think it should matter to you. He sealed it, addressed it to the minister's private office, and set it on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached into his bag and took out the full set of briefs for the Thursday hearing, and spent the next 3 hours working through them by the light of his wand in the quiet kitchen of Grimmauld Place, the house settling around him with the particular sounds of old stone and old magic, familiar and no longer threatening. The work was almost done. Not the long work would take years. But the piece of it that had to happen first, the thing that made the rest possible, the record and the evidence and the proof on paper that the system had failed and that failure had names and dates and consequences, that work was almost done. He just needed Thursday to go right. Wednesday night, Hermione found him in the Leaky Cauldron Library Annex, a small room off the main bar that Tom kept stocked with a rotating selection of legal and historical texts and that had become, over the past 3 weeks, essentially Harry and Hermione's second office. She came in with 2 cups of tea and a look that was the research version of excited, the specific brightness she got when she had found the piece that completes the picture. "The Dementor brief," she said. "What about it?" "I had it assessed by a wizarding law specialist this afternoon. An independent one, Professor Marchetti from the European Institute of Magical Law in Florence. He's the foremost expert on the goblin accords in the wizarding world, and he owes Professor McGonagall a favor of unspecified nature that she was kind enough to redeem on our behalf." She sat down and pushed his tea toward him. "He says the analysis is correct. The breach of the 1295 Accords is unambiguous, the forfeiture clause is valid, and the Ministry's authority over the Azkaban Dementor colony has had no legal grounding since 1890. Did he put that in writing?" She produced a document. Notarized, authenticated, and already filed with Gringotts and the Motion Committee. Harry looked at it. Independent expert opinion. Not a Gringotts goblin, not a ministry official, not an interested party. A recognized international authority with no institutional stake in the outcome. Motion 4's committee just got something it can't ignore, he said. That's what Professor Marchetti said, Hermione said. In considerably more formal language, but yes. He also said, she looked down at the document, that in his professional opinion, the mandatory Dementor withdrawal from Azkaban would require a complete structural rethinking of Wizarding Britain's approach to criminal justice, and that such a rethinking was approximately 2 centuries overdue. She looked up. He's not wrong. No, Harry said. He's not. He picked up his tea. Hermione. After Thursday, after the hearing, whatever it produces, we're going to need to start thinking about what comes after. Not just what we're tearing down. What we're building. She looked at him steadily. I've already been thinking about it. I know you have. I have 17 pages of notes, she said. Of course you do. Do you want to read them tonight or, tonight, he said. We've got time. She reached into her bag. He suspected she had been waiting for him to ask since approximately last Tuesday. The notes she produced were color-coded and tabbed, and the first page had a diagram that was 3 different kinds of comprehensive. He looked at it and thought, this is what the morning after looks like. Not chaos, not a vacuum, this. Someone who loved the world enough to think carefully about how to make it work, while the battle was still going on. He picked up his quill. All right, he said. Show me. Chapter 5. After the fall, the oversight panel convened at 9 on a Thursday morning in a room that was smaller than the Wisengamot chamber but in some ways more charged, a long table, 12 seats, no public gallery, just the panel members and the parties involved and the particular intimacy of a proceeding that knew it was being watched even without an audience. Lord Havelock Crest chaired the oversight panel. He was 71 years old, had held the Crest family seat for 38 years, had voted against Fudge's block on 11 consecutive motions over the past decade, and had the specific patience of a man who had been waiting a very long time for something worth chairing. He called the session to order at 9:03, noted that the Ministry of Magic had failed to produce the requested documentation within the statutory 7-day period, and invited the minister to explain. Fudge was present. This had not been certain. There had been some signal on Wednesday through intermediaries, some suggestion that the minister might send a representative, a legal counsel, someone with a title and prepared statements but not the specific liability of being Fudge in a room where Fudge was the problem. But he came himself, and Harry read that as its own kind of information. Fudge coming himself meant either confidence or desperation, and the quality of his expression, the careful, managed pleasantness stretched just slightly too tight, said desperation wearing confidence's clothes. He had his solicitor with him. A neat man named Huxley with a folder and the expression of someone being paid not to look concerned. He had Percy's replacement, a senior assistant Harry didn't recognize. He did not have Lucius Malfoy, which was notable. In the Wisengamot session, Malfoy had been physically proximate to Fudge's interests, visible and present. Today he was absent, and an absent Malfoy was a Malfoy who had made a calculation about distances. Harry had Hermione to his left and Amelia Bones to his right in the observer section. Neville was across the table in his panel seat. He'd been formally appointed to the oversight panel as a Wisingamot lord with standing interest in Motion 1, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of giving someone a ringside seat and a gavel. Crest looked at Fudge. Minister. The file. Fudge's solicitor rose. The ministry respectfully submits that the evidence request as filed may be subject to a national security classification that supersedes Wisingamot evidence protocols under which statute? Crest said. A pause. The 1982 Security Classification, there is number 1982 Security Classification Act, Neville said, from his panel seat. Conversationally, the way you'd point out that someone had spinach in their teeth. He produced a document and placed it on the table. This is a written confirmation from the ministry's own legislative archive, dated 2 days ago, confirming that no such act exists. I submitted the research request on Monday and received the response yesterday afternoon. He paused. The archive also noted, in the same response, that this statute has been cited as grounds for file restriction in 14 separate cases over the past decade, none of which involved any actual legislative authority. Huxley looked at the document. Something in his expression shifted, the look of a man whose script has just been removed from his hands. He sat down. Fudge said nothing. His hands, flat on the table in front of him, were very still. The file, Crest said again. What happened next took 4 hours and felt like watching a wall come down in slow motion, each piece separable and distinct, the whole becoming irrevocable only when you stepped back and looked at how many pieces had fallen. Fudge produced the file. Not voluntarily, it was produced under a formal panel order that Crest signed and which was delivered to the ministry archive by Neville in person, accompanied by Amelia Bones, who had the quality of a person whose entire career had been preparation for this specific errand. The archive staff, confronted with the order and the director of magical law enforcement standing in front of them, produced the file in 40 minutes. It was 412 pages. Harry read the summary Bones had prepared while the full file went to the panel's reviewing members, and the summary was enough to understand why Fudge had not wanted it produced. The investigation into Cedric Diggory's death had been completed in 6 weeks, as Harry had said at the Wisingamot session. The full file showed that the lead investigator, a senior Auror named Savage, had submitted a preliminary report at the end of Week 2 recommending expanded investigation, citing 12 separate anomalies in the evidence that were inconsistent with the ministry's public narrative. The recommendation had been rejected by the minister's office in a memo that used the phrase, "does not serve public interest," 4 times in 2 paragraphs. The Auror's original report, the expanded investigation he'd recommended and been denied, was attached to his final file notes as an addendum. He'd apparently kept it, quietly, and included it in the archive copy without explicit authorization. It was 63 pages. Harry read it in the anteroom during the mid-morning recess, standing up, while Hermione read over his shoulder, and neither of them spoke until they were done. The 63 pages established, with the methodical precision of a professional who knew exactly what he was documenting and why, that the evidence at the third task site was consistent with exactly what Harry had said happened, port key to a graveyard, Dark Lord, ritual, escape, and inconsistent, in multiple specific and documented ways, with the official conclusion of an accident. He knew, Hermione said. Savage knew from Week 2, Harry said. Not Savage. Fudge. She looked at him. He had this report. He had it in his own file and he sat in the Wisingamot last year and the year before and called you a liar. Harry looked at the document in his hands. Yes, he said. He did. He carried the Savage report into the hearing room when the recess ended, placed a copy on the panel table, and said, in the quietest voice he'd used all morning, "This is the investigation Fudge's office suppressed." The lead investigator recommended expanded evidence gathering within 2 weeks of Cedric Diggory's death, and was denied by ministerial instruction. The 63-page preliminary report he prepared is now in evidence. I'd like it formally entered into the record alongside the non-compliance notice, the fake statute citation, and the original evidence request. Crest entered it. Fudge looked at the table. His solicitor leaned close and said something very quietly. Fudge didn't react, didn't acknowledge it, just looked at the table with the expression of a man who has been somewhere too long and knows it. Amelia Bones spoke for 40 minutes during the evidence presentation phase, and it was the most precise 40 minutes Harry had seen in a professional setting. She had spent, she would tell him later, 15 years preparing for exactly this kind of proceeding, not this specific case, but a case like it, where the documented record was sufficient and the institutional framework was intact enough to process it. She laid out the DMLE internal reports, the Death Eater activity monitoring data, the pattern of suppression and denial from the minister's office over the past 14 months. She presented it without editorializing, without the slightest hint of personal grievance, and the effect was somehow more devastating for the restraint, just the facts, sequenced, building an architecture of institutional failure that required no interpretation because the brickwork was its own argument. When she finished, Lord Crest looked at the panel members around the table. Questions. There were questions. Many of them. They took 2 more hours, and most of them were addressed to Fudge's legal team, and most of Huxley's answers were some variant of that matter is under review or the ministry's position is subject to ongoing assessment, phrases which, by the 3rd time, had achieved a kind of self-satirizing quality, an implicit acknowledgement that they were placeholders where answers should be. One question was addressed to Harry. A panel member named Lord Blackwood, Ancient House, moderate, the kind of man who had spent 30 years voting carefully and going home, looked at Harry and said, "Lord Potter. You've presented a significant body of evidence over the past 2 weeks. You've filed motions, submissions, briefs, expert opinions, internal documents. Most 16-year-olds, he paused, apparently aware that this sentence was going somewhere that required care, are not operating at this level. Where is this coming from?" Harry looked at him. "The evidence existed before I found it," he said. Amelia Bones had files. The Gringotts legal department had records. The ministry archive had documents. Percy Weasley had internal correspondence. Hermione Granger found the original Goblin Accords text that the ministry version had been edited to remove. He paused. "What I did was ask for things and read what people gave me. The information was always there. It just needed someone with standing to file it." He looked at Blackwood steadily. "That's all I did. I had standing, and I used it." Blackwood was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Thank you," he said. The panel's preliminary findings were delivered at 5 o'clock. Lord Crest read them aloud with the measured, unhurried delivery of someone who understood that the words were going to matter and wanted them to land with the weight they deserved. The panel found, unanimously, that the Ministry of Magic had obstructed Wisingamot proceedings in violation of the 1821 Governance Act. That the evidence request non-compliance was without lawful justification. That the suppressed Auror report constituted deliberate obstruction of a formal investigation. That the citation of a non-existent statute was a serious procedural irregularity requiring further investigation. That the matters raised in Motion 2, the return of Voldemort, were supported by sufficient evidence to warrant formal ministry acknowledgement and response. The panel did not remove Fudge from office. It didn't have that power. What it had was the power to refer, to record, to make the case and pass it up the chain, and it used that power without ambiguity, a formal referral to the Wisingamot's full judicial committee, with a recommendation for emergency session. When Crest finished reading, the room was quiet. Fudge stood up. He buttoned his robes with the slow precision of someone performing a task while thinking about something else. He looked at Harry once, just once, and it was not a hostile look, which Harry hadn't expected. It was something more complicated, more tired, the look of a man who has been holding a position for a long time and has finally felt it give. He left. His solicitor followed. The door closed. Bones leaned over to Harry and said, quietly, "He's going to resign." "When?" "Tomorrow morning, if he's smart. End of the week if he needs to manage the optics." She paused. "He got my letter this morning." Harry looked at her. "What letter?" I gave him the same choice you did, in terms he'd find more professionally persuasive, she said. Voluntary cooperation and resignation with dignity versus contempt proceedings and the full judicial file. I included a specific reference to the Hopkirk legal framework documents and the 1811 Ministerial Authority Act correspondence. She straightened her robes. I told him the second path leads to places he does not want to go. I think he believed me. Harry was quiet for a moment. You didn't tell me you were writing to him. No, she agreed. I didn't. She looked at him with a kind of dry precision. We're even. He almost laughed. Fair. Hermione cried in the corridor outside the hearing room. Not the heaving, distressed kind, the other kind, the kind that happens when you have been operating under sustained pressure for long enough that the first moment of release doesn't feel like relief but like the body simply insisting on its due. She was leaning against the wall with her arms wrapped around herself and her face turned up toward the ministry's dead white ceiling, and the tears were running down her face with the silent efficiency of something that had been waiting very patiently. Harry stood beside her. He didn't say anything. After a moment she said, without looking at him, "It worked." "It worked," he said. "I was scared it wouldn't," she said. "I wasn't going to say that beforehand because I didn't want to undermine anything, but I was, Harry, I was terrified that we'd get to today and something would go wrong and the files would disappear or the panel would be stacked or Fudge would produce some procedural weapon we hadn't thought of, and all of it would just dissolve, and we'd be back where we started." "I know," Harry said. "How were you so calm?" He thought about it. "I wasn't always," he said. "There were nights, I had nights where I was very much not calm. But when I was in the room, doing the thing, I think once you've actually decided that you're not going to stop, the fear changes. It becomes about logistics rather than outcomes." He paused. "Also, you were doing most of the terrified thinking for both of us, which freed me up considerably." She made a sound that was approximately half a sob and half a laugh. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at him. "That was extremely rude." "It was a compliment," he said. "You think better frightened than most people do relaxed." She looked at him for a moment and then she hugged him, quickly and fiercely, and he hugged her back and they stood in the ministry corridor under the fluorescent lights with the distant sound of the building's ordinary business going on around them. Neville appeared from the hearing room doorway, Longbottom House pin still on his lapel, and took in the scene with the equanimity of a man who had survived fifth year alongside both of them. "Are we celebrating," he said, "or processing?" "Both," Hermione said, stepping back and composing herself with impressive speed. "Right," Neville said. "Italian place in the alley. My treat." Cornelius Fudge announced his resignation the following morning. Harry read it in the Prophet, the full version this time, front page, cuff byline again, and the story was thorough, almost respectful in its thoroughness, carrying the weight of something the paper had been waiting to write for a long time. The resignation statement was brief and used the phrase "the best interests of the wizarding community" 4 times and never once specified what those interests were, which was consistent with Fudge's entire 15-year tenure. He cited health. He cited a desire for private life. He did not cite the oversight panel or the evidence file or the 12 investigations that were now active in various branches of the ministry, because citing them would require acknowledging them and acknowledging them would require acknowledging why they existed. But the subtext was the story, and the story was unavoidable, and every witch and wizard reading the Prophet that morning could follow the thread from the resignation to the hearing to the 5 motions to the boy who had walked into Gringotts 3 weeks ago and asked a goblin to show him the ledgers. Harry put the paper down and drank his tea. At the Leaky Cauldron, the morning crowd was louder than usual. Several people caught his eye and looked away, or nodded, or in one case, an older wizard Harry didn't recognize, raised their cup in a small, silent acknowledgement. He returned it. His scar didn't hurt. It hadn't hurt since Wednesday. He didn't know if that meant something or if it was coincidence, but he noted it. Amelia Bones was named acting Minister of Magic by the Wisengamot Interim Governance Committee on Saturday afternoon, pending a full ministerial selection process. Harry hadn't suggested this, he'd mentioned her name to Crest in passing, during a brief conversation after the panel hearing, when Crest had asked who he thought would be capable of holding the ministry together during a transition. But the appointment came through channels that had nothing to do with Harry directly, and that was, he thought, the point. The change had to have its own momentum. He could provide the initial force, but if the change needed him personally to sustain it, it wasn't change, it was dependency with a different name. He wrote to Bones, "Congratulations. Don't let it make you careful." She wrote back, "Don't let it make you complacent." He put her letter in the top drawer of the desk at Grimmauld Place, which he had quietly begun to treat as a base of operations. The house was still heavy with its history, the Black family tapestry was still there, the curtains over Mrs. Black's portrait were still there, but it was beginning to feel like somewhere that could be inhabited rather than endured. He'd spent 3 evenings there in the past week, sometimes with Hermione, sometimes with Neville, sometimes alone, and the aloneness had started to feel less like grief and more like the particular quiet of a place that was waiting to become something. Remus had come by on Friday evening. Harry had been expecting him, or not expecting him specifically, but expecting someone, some emissary of the world he'd moved in for 5 years that was now reshaping itself around events he'd set in motion. Remus was the right person. Remus was always the right person for difficult conversations because he had no personal stake in Harry being anything other than exactly what he was. He'd sat in the Grimmauld Place kitchen with his hands around a cup of tea and looked at Harry with the steady, careful attention of a man who had survived a great deal and understood the cost of various kinds of effort. "How are you?" he said. "I'm all right," Harry said. And meant it, which was still slightly surprising. Remus nodded slowly. "Dumbledore wanted me to come." "I know. He doesn't want anything from you," Remus said. He asked me to tell you that he's proud of you, and that he's sorry, and that if you want his help with what comes next, the Voldemort piece, he is available. Without conditions." A pause. "Those are his words. Without conditions." Harry thought about Dumbledore at Privet Drive, the steadiness of him, the genuine sorrow on his face when Harry had named the things that had been taken. The "you'll have them" when Harry had asked for direct answers. "Tell him I know," Harry said. "And tell him yes. The Voldemort piece, yes, I want his help. I've always wanted his help. I just needed it to be help, not management." Remus looked at him for a long moment. "You sound like your mother," he said softly. "James would have broken 3 things and yelled himself hoarse first. Lily would have had the conversation you just had." "People keep telling me that," Harry said. "It's a compliment," Remus said. "Both of them, but Lily especially. She had the rarest kind of intelligence. The kind that doesn't need to be loud." He was quiet for a moment, the kitchen holding its stillness around them. "Sirius would have loved to see this week." "I know," Harry said. He looked at the photograph on the kitchen counter, the one he'd brought down from upstairs, the one with the 3 of them, young and laughing. "I thought about him the whole time. Every session, every filing. I kept thinking, this is what he would have had, if the system had done its job. This is what any of us would have had." Remus didn't say anything for a while. He just sat with the weight of that, the way he sat with all heavy things, not trying to lift it or resolve it but just being present with it, and that was its own kind of gift. "What comes next?" he said, eventually. "Voldemort," Harry said. "He's been watching everything that's happened. He understands that a ministry in transition is simultaneously vulnerable and less controllable. It's harder for him to exploit it the way he planned because the specific institutional mechanisms he was going to use have been disrupted. But he's not going to stop. He's going to adapt and move faster." Harry looked at the table. "I want to be ready for that. Not reactive, actually ready. Which means understanding what we're actually fighting. Which is an ideology," Harry said. "Not a person. Tom Riddle is the current host of the ideology, but it's not personal. Blood purity, the hierarchy, the belief that some lives matter more than others, that's older than Voldemort and it'll survive him if all we do is defeat him. We have to dismantle the logic, not just the man. He paused. The Wisengamot work, the Dementor Accords, the structural reform, the trial records review, that's part of it. You can't build a better world on the same foundations. You have to go down to the ground level. Remus was looking at him with an expression Harry couldn't quite name. It was warm and complicated and had some grief in it, but underneath the grief there was something that looked very much like hope. You've grown into someone extraordinary, Remus said quietly. I had help, Harry said. You let the help in, Remus said. Which is harder than it sounds. The formal Wisengamot session called for the structural reforms was scheduled for the last week of July. Harry spent the days between the oversight hearing and the session in a state of focused preparation that felt different from the first session's preparation, less discovery, more construction. The first session had been about putting things on the record. This one was about what to do with what was there. Hermione had 17 pages of notes that had become 41 pages of notes, and she presented them to Harry and Neville at the Grimmauld Place kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with the quiet authority of someone who has done the thinking and is now simply explaining the conclusions. The framework she proposed was precise and coherent and grounded in every legal precedent and historical example she'd found in 6 weeks of intensive research. It was also, Harry thought, genuinely good, not just legally sound but right, in the deeper sense, the sense of someone who had thought not just about mechanics but about people and what they needed from a governing structure. The Wisengamot reform had 4 pillars: independent representation, hereditary, elected, and expert seats, with no ministry-appointed category, transparent process, all votes public, all deliberations recorded, all evidence verifiable, rights foundation, a codified charter of magical rights that applied to everyone in Wizarding Britain regardless of blood status, species, or affiliation, and accountability, formal oversight of ministry executive action by the Wisengamot, with the specific no confidence and removal mechanisms that had never previously existed. Neville read through it twice, methodically. The rights foundation, he said. That's the piece that'll face the most pushback from the conservative houses. I know, Hermione said. That's why it's structured as a framework rather than a specific list. The framework establishes the principle that rights exist and apply universally, and the specific codification comes through subsequent legislation. It's harder to oppose a principle than a list. You can argue with a list. You can find exceptions. The principle either stands or it doesn't. Neville thought about that. She's right, he said to Harry. She usually is, Harry said. Hermione looked pleased. I've also drafted the language for the Dementor withdrawal from Azkaban to be part of the Justice Reform Clause. It references the Marchetti opinion and the original Accord's text, so it's pre-evidenced. The committee can adopt it directly. What about prisoner relocation? Neville said. If the Dementors leave Azkaban, we need somewhere to put the prisoners and some way to hold them. 300-year-old building on an island in the North Sea, Hermione said. I suggest we keep the island and remove the torturers. She pulled out another sheaf. I've been working with an architectural and magical structures expert, Professor Vector recommended him, on a redesign concept. Physical wards, magical constraint systems, structured rehabilitation. It's not finished, but the principle is that imprisonment exists to protect the community, not to cause suffering. Those are compatible goals. Harry looked at the document she slid across the table. The design concept was thorough. Of course it was. He thought about the first time he'd been near a Dementor, in 3rd year, on the Hogwarts Express, the cold, the despair, the way the world had gone grey at the edges and the worst memories had rushed forward. He thought about Sirius spending 12 years in a building full of them. He thought about innocent people who had been imprisoned alongside guilty ones, all of them subjected to the same thing, and no one had raised a formal objection until a 16-year-old with a legal text and too much suppressed anger had sat down and done the math. This is good, he said. All of it. Let's take it to the session. The last Gringotts session of July opened on a Tuesday morning under a ceiling that showed genuine summer sky, cloudless, the deep precise blue of a heat wave, and the chamber had a different atmosphere than the first session 3 weeks ago. Then, it had been shock and resistance and the tight-held attention of people confronted with something unexpected. Now it was something more complex, still resistant in places, still fearful in places, but with a current of something new running through it, the feeling of a room that has processed what happened and is trying to decide what to do about it. Marchbanks was in the Chief Warlock's chair. Neville had his seat. Augusta Longbottom was in the observer gallery with an expression of comprehensive satisfaction. Amelia Bones was in the acting minister's box, Fudge's box, though it had already been redesignated as the executive observer gallery in a quiet administrative change that someone in the clerical office had apparently felt was appropriate. Lucius Malfoy was present. He was in his seat. He was quiet. Harry had been thinking about Malfoy since the oversight panel, since the absence that had spoken louder than presence, and what he had concluded was this: Malfoy was not broken, was not defeated, was not going to simply vanish from the political landscape because the minister he'd backed had resigned. He was a man who had survived the fall of one Dark Lord by the expedient of claiming Imperius, and he was an intelligent man, and intelligent men in political crisis did not disappear, they repositioned. The question was which direction. Harry didn't have an answer to that yet. He filed it under ongoing. He presented the reform framework in sections, with Neville taking the justice reform pillar and Hermione, in the formal capacity of legal advisor to House Potter, a designation they had created specifically because the alternative was Harry repeatedly saying my friend who has done most of the actual work, presenting the rights foundation and the structural representation changes. Hermione presenting to the Wizengamot was, Harry thought, watching her from the central floor, one of the more impressive things he had ever seen. She stood at the lectern as though she had been standing at lecterns her entire life, which in a sense she had. Every classroom she'd ever walked into had been a practice run, and she was precise, measured, occasionally brilliant, and absolutely unintimidated by the 73 people looking at her. When a lord from the conservative bloc raised an objection about the rights framework's implications for existing blood purity legislation, she cited 4 precedents, all from British wizarding history, all showing that the existing legislation was inconsistent not just with the proposed framework but with earlier versions of its own underlying principles, and the lord sat down without a follow-up. From the gallery, Harry heard Augusta Longbottom make a very quiet sound of approval. The weighted votes were cast at noon. The structural representation reforms, elimination of ministry-appointed seats, introduction of independent expert seats, passed 42 to 29. The strongest margin of any substantive vote Harry had seen in 3 weeks, and it came partly from ancient House members who had voted against Motion 5's first version 3 weeks ago and had changed their positions, and their positions had changed because the 1811 documents were now in the public record and it was no longer possible to defend the appointed seats without defending the explicit intent of their creators. The Rights Foundation framework passed 37 to 31 with 5 abstentions, narrower, as Neville had predicted, but it passed. The principle was on the record. The codification work would take time, but the principle was there, established, a thing that now existed in the law. The Justice Reform Package, Dementor withdrawal, prison restructuring, the independent review of the 1979 to 82 cases, passed 39 to 28. When Marchbanks called the final count, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then sound, not organized, not a cheer, nothing that coordinated, just the general acoustic expression of 73 people collectively exhaling. Harry stood at the central lectern and looked at the chamber and thought about everything that had brought him here. The letter from Gringotts that had arrived on a Tuesday in a house he'd always been told he should be grateful for. The suppression charms dissolving in a room 4 levels below the main floor of a bank while 4 goblin practitioners worked in silence. The empty ledgers and the full ones, and the face of Sharp Axe who had waited 15 years for someone withstanding to come and look at what the ledgers contained. Sirius's photograph on a desk in the smallest bedroom of his own house. The cold, clarifying anger that had replaced grief somewhere in the 3rd week of June, and the work that had come out of it. He thought, this is not the end. Voldemort is still out there. The ideology is still embedded in places where laws can't immediately reach. The reform committees will face obstruction and delay and the grinding resistance of institutions that have been doing things one way for centuries. The Death Eater trials will uncover things that are going to be painful and complicated and politically explosive. The world being built here is going to be incomplete and imperfect and require constant maintenance by people who are willing to do the unglamorous work of holding institutions to the standards they claim to uphold. He thought, but the record exists. And the record is the thing that makes everything else possible. He left the lectern. Outside the ministry it was a bright Tuesday afternoon, the city blazing with July heat, and Harry sat on the steps of the telephone box entrance, not on the invisible magical steps but the Muggle Street corner, on a low wall, in the actual London sun, and let himself be still for a moment. Neville came and sat beside him without asking if it was all right. Harry appreciated this. It was definitely all right, and the not asking was a form of knowing him. "How do you feel?" Neville said. Harry thought about it. "Like something is beginning rather than ending," he said. "Which is slightly exhausting but also, right. It would be wrong if it felt like an ending. Because it isn't." "Because it isn't," Harry agreed. They sat for a moment in the mid-afternoon noise of London, traffic and voices and a pigeon doing something purposeful near the wall's base, and it was ordinary and enormous and entirely itself. "My mum's case is going to the review panel in September," Neville said. Not casually, the words had the specific weight of something that had been carried for a long time. The full trial record. Both parents. He paused. "Gran says she'll be there for the hearing." She hasn't attended any of the official proceedings since 1981. She said she couldn't." A pause. "She says she can now." Harry didn't say anything. He just stayed where he was, present and quiet, the way Remus had been in the Grimmauld Place kitchen. After a moment, Neville nodded, once, to himself, and looked at the street. "What happens with Voldemort?" he said, back to the practical. "He moves," Harry said. "He's been watching and waiting for the ministry transition to settle. He'll come at some point before the autumn, I think, either to try to exploit the political gap or to make a statement that says the ministry reforms don't matter because he's above them." Harry looked at the middle distance. Dumbledore's back in the picture, actively. Bones has the DMLE working at full capacity for the first time in years. The Auror Force is being rebuilt without Fudge's political interference. He paused. "And I'm not going to be caught flat-footed again. 5 years of being in the dark is over." Neville was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid of him?" The question was genuine, asked the way Neville asked things, directly, without decoration, expecting a real answer. Harry thought about the graveyard. The cold and the green light and Cedric's body on the ground. He thought about the Department of Mysteries, the veil, Sirius's hand breaking contact with his in the crowd. He thought about the suppression charms dissolving and the world opening up around him, and the clarity that had come with it, and the anger that had clarified into purpose. "No," he said. "I'm not afraid of him." He looked at his hands. "I was. For a long time, I was. But I think, once you understand what someone's actually made of, the fear changes. I know what he is. A man who chose power over humanity and lost both in the process. I know what he can do. I'll be prepared for what he can do." He paused. "But I'm not afraid of him." Neville considered this. "All right," he said. "Good. Are you?" Neville thought for a moment. "Not the way I used to be," he said. "In first year I was afraid of everything. I was afraid of my own shadow. I was afraid of you, actually, for about the first month, not you specifically, just, the thing you represented. The chosen one, the prophecy, all of it. It felt very large and very beyond me." He paused. "Now I think, beyond me or not, it's here. And being afraid of it doesn't make it smaller. So I might as well just do the work." Harry looked at him. That's a remarkably sane way to look at it. I've been working on it, Neville said. Hermione found them on the wall 20 minutes later and sat down between them with her bag and the expression she got when there were several things she needed to say and was determining the most efficient order. The reform vote, she said. 343. 43 votes out of 73 for the Rights Foundation framework, in a Wisengamot that 3 weeks ago had not passed a rights-related motion in 40 years. 37, Harry said. The rights vote was 37. I know. I said 43 because I counted the 3 who abstained and will almost certainly vote yes when it comes back for codification. She looked at him. You were at the lectern. You didn't see their faces when Malfoy voted. Harry turned. Malfoy voted? For the Justice Reform Package, Hermione said. Not for the Rights Foundation, not for the representation changes. But the Justice Reform, the Dementor withdrawal, the trial reviews. She paused. He voted yes. Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about the calculation Malfoy was always performing, the constant cold assessment of positions and futures and what a given choice would cost against what it would return. He thought about Draco Malfoy in school, the same calculation in miniature, the posturing and the cruelty as instruments of positioning rather than feeling, and underneath them the specific anxiety of someone who had been given a set of values by people who loved him and was beginning to understand that the values were wrong. He thought about Lucius Malfoy voting yes on the Dementor withdrawal, with full knowledge that the trial review would eventually reach cases that connected to him, because a man of Malfoy's intelligence would not vote for something without understanding what it could cost him. He's moving, Harry said. Not toward us specifically. Away from Voldemort. He's calculating that Voldemort's trajectory ends badly and that the new ministry is a survivable position if he gets there carefully. Should we trust it? Neville said. No, Harry said. But we can use it. There's a difference. He thought for a moment. He's not our ally. But he's a variable that has moved, and in a chamber with those margins, every moved variable matters. He looked at Hermione. Did you note the vote in the record summary? Already sent to the Gringotts evidence file, she said. Good. The 3 of them sat on the wall in the July afternoon and the city moved around them, indifferent and enormous, and the magical world moved somewhere underneath it and above it and through it, and somewhere in both worlds things were changing, not all at once, not cleanly, not in the way that stories sometimes resolved with a clear ending that closed all the doors, but changing, the way real things changed, gradually and then suddenly and then gradually again, each piece requiring the next. The work ongoing, the beginning visible now where before there had been only the long grey middle. Harry thought about the letter he still owed his parents. Not literally, there was no mechanism for that, and he was done with the particular grief of wanting things that couldn't exist. But he thought about what he would say if he could. Not "I'm sorry" or "I miss you," those were true and real and had their place. But something more specific. He thought he would say, "I found the ledgers. I read the will. I know what you wanted from me, and I know what was taken, and I want you to know that the taking is over. I claimed it back. All of it. And I'm going to do something with it that you'd recognize." He thought he would say, "I know what I am. And I know what to do about it." He thought that would be enough. Food? Neville said. Food, Harry said. The Italian place is getting very familiar with us, Hermione said, sliding off the wall. They remembered my order last time, Neville said. I found that reassuring. That's because you ordered the same thing 3 times, Hermione said. It's a good dish, Neville said, with dignity. Harry laughed. He was standing in a London street in July, surrounded by the 2 best people he knew, in a world that was broken in ways that needed fixing but was also, for the first time in his memory, actually in the process of being fixed. The work ahead was real and difficult and would take years and would require all of them and more people besides. Voldemort was still out there, making calculations, preparing to move. The new ministry was fragile and finding its feet. The ancient houses were shifting in their alignments and the outcomes were not guaranteed. Nothing was guaranteed. He thought, and none of that is a reason to be afraid. He thought, it's a reason to keep going. He walked down the London street with Hermione on his left and Neville on his right and the summer heat coming off the pavement in visible waves, and he thought about everything that had started with a letter from a bank and a boy who had finally decided to read it. He thought, the record exists. He thought, that's enough. For now, that's enough. The beginning was made. The rest was work. And Harry Potter had never, in his entire life, been afraid of work.